Hello there, and welcome to Forgotten Worlds. My name is Thomas, and tonight I'll be your guide through a journey into Earth's deep past, a time when our planet looked nothing like the world you know. We're traveling back about 359 million years, to the Carboniferous Period, an age when Earth was a green cathedral of forests stretching endlessly across swamps, where giant dragonflies skimmed the air and amphibians the size of crocodiles haunted the waters. It was a world breathing differently than ours, with oxygen levels so high that life itself seemed to swell beyond today's limits. This was not the Earth of cities and continents as you recognized them, but a place of alien landscapes and evolutionary experiments, a time when nature was still deciding what life on land could become. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through that forgotten world together. But before we step fully into the Carboniferous, let me invite you into the community that makes these journeys possible. If you find comfort in drifting through these ancient landscapes, I'd be so grateful if you left a like and subscribed. It helps other wanderers discover our quiet explorations. And in the comments, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel, and it always feels like we're sharing a moment across oceans and time zones. So settle in, let your breath slow, and let your thoughts drift backward. To begin, we need to unroll the map of the Carboniferous world, a planet not yet divided into the continents you know, but a vast swampy land shaped by rising seas and gathering supercontinents. The map of the Carboniferous world would not have resembled the globe you carry in your mind. Forget the neat outlines of North America, Europe, or Asia. Erase the Atlantic Ocean, the familiar shapes of Africa and South America. In their place, picture land masses sliding slowly together, pulled by forces hidden beneath the crust, knitting themselves into the earliest outlines of what would one day be called Pangaea. At the equator, where warmth and moisture gathered in endless supply, vast swamps unfurled like green oceans across the land. They weren't small, local marshes like you might see today, but immense ecosystems stretching for thousands of miles. Imagine standing there, barefoot on spongy soil, the air so heavy with humidity that every breath felt like inhaling through water. The ground would be soft beneath you, rich with decomposing plants that never fully broke down. This was the beginning of the coal beds we still mine today, but to you in that moment, it would feel like walking across a living sponge. Shallow seas leapt against the coasts, but the boundary between land and water was never fixed. Floodplains gave way to lagoons. Lagoons merged into marshes, and swamps bled into estuaries. The horizon would not have been a straight line of ocean meeting sky, but a shifting mosaic of reeds, trees, and water surfaces reflecting the light of a different sun. You would hear the slow creak of vegetation bending under its own weight, the soft trickle of water moving unseen through roots, the distant calls of creatures that had only recently emerged from the sea. From the poles to the equator, Earth wore a patchwork skin. In the north, what we now call Laurussia, a fusion of North America and parts of Europe, stretched broad and green. To the south, Gondwana sprawled across much of the planet, a land mass so massive it stretched from the equator all the way to the polar ice. Between them, island chains and smaller continental fragments floated like stepping stones across shallow seas, some destined to crash together, others to vanish into subduction zones, swallowed by the planet's deep mantle. If you had soared above it, riding on the back of some great dragonfly of the age, the world below would have looked half familiar, half unsettling. Green equatorial swamps traced rivers the size of seas. inland, mountain ranges rose where continents had collided, jagged and raw, not yet softened by erosion. Elsewhere, lowlands shimmered under seasonal floods, and in the far south, glaciers crept outward, white scars cutting across a darker land. The earth was not uniform. It was a place of extremes, and geography dictated everything. What you might notice most, though, was scale. Modern maps give us the illusion of control. Borders drawn with precision. Oceans colored neatly in blue. The Carboniferous map refused neatness. Everything blurred. Land into water, forest into swamp, continent into continent. Imagine the disorientation of traveling across it. One week you might walk through forests so dense it blocked the sky. The next, you would find yourself on open floodplain, with the sound of insects carrying farther than your own footsteps. Keep going, and eventually you might reach shallow seas so wide they felt like oceans, but still clear enough to wade across in some places, the water warm against your legs, filled with fish and early sharks. There were no cities, no roads, no human names. The map of the Carboniferous was a living map, drawn not in ink, but in rivers shifting course, in forests expanding, in glaciers advancing and retreating. Every season redrew the lines, every flood carved new channels. To live there was to accept that the world beneath your feet was restless. Picture the equator, where most of the swamps lay. The air was hot, wet, almost soup-like. You could press your palm against a tree trunk and feel the moisture cling to your skin. Leaves glistened with condensation, and mist hung low in the mornings, turning the forest into a green cathedral, where light filtered in shafts through branches taller than most modern buildings. The smell would be rich, earthy, almost overwhelming, the scent of constant growth layered over constant decay. Now shift your gaze southward, toward Gondwana. Here the story changes. As the Carboniferous wore on, the southern reaches of the continent slid across latitudes, edging toward the pole. Glaciers spread, grinding rock into dust, leaving striations across the land. Imagine the silence of those frozen expanses. Only the crack of ice shifting, the low moan of wind carrying over endless white. These southern glaciers seemed like a contradiction to the steaming equatorial swamps, but they existed at the same time, proof that Earth has always been a place of juxtapositions. Between these extremes lay transitional lands, dry interiors where rain rarely reached, coastlines where shallow seas turned sunlit waters into nurseries for marine life, highlands that caught storms and fed rivers down into the swamps. Every contour mattered, every hill, every valley, every inland sea reshaped the climate around it. Earth's geography was not background, it was the author of life's possibilities. Imagine for a moment walking across a low coastal plain. The tide has retreated, leaving behind tidal pools alive with strange creatures. Early horseshoe crabs scuttle across wet sand, their shells gleaming in the sun. Beyond them, reeds sway in shallow water, and the air hums with insects. If you close your eyes, you might hear the wings of giant dragonflies slicing through the heavy air, a sound like paper being torn slowly, deliberately. Now lift your eyes to the horizon. Instead of oceans stretching unbroken, you would see distant land, perhaps the faint line of another continent, not far across a shallow sea. Travel in the Carboniferous was less about ships crossing vast oceans and more about moving through wetlands, across land bridges, along coastlines where ecosystems blended together. It was a world of connections, and these connections mattered. They allowed plants and animals to spread far and wide, mixing across regions. A tree that sprouted in what we would now call North America might find its descendants thriving thousands of miles away in what would become Europe. An amphibian that crawled out of a swamp in present-day Africa might find the distant cousins in Asia. The forming supercontinent of Pangaea was not yet complete, but already it was drawing life together. And yet, despite all this merging, the world was never static. The crust beneath it shifted. Continents drifted, mountains rose, rivers changed course, carving new valleys and abandoning old ones. Shallow seas flooded plains, then retreated, leaving behind layers of silt and the fossils of creatures trapped in the tides. To live in the Carboniferous was to exist in a place of constant rearrangement, where maps were temporary sketches, erased and redrawn by the earth itself. From above, the planet must have seemed alive in a different way. Green swathes of swamp, forest pulsing with photosynthesis, white glaciers advancing like slow tides, blue-green seas spreading and shrinking. Even the air itself carried the story of this geography. Oxygen levels climbed, shaped by the endless plant growth in equatorial swamps. To breathe there would have been exhilarating, each breath filling your chest with more oxygen than modern lungs are used to. Fires would have spread more easily, lightning igniting entire forests in flashes that lit the night sky. The land, the air, the seas, all braided together in feedback loops, each reshaping the other. Perhaps the most haunting thought of all is how alien it would have felt to stand anywhere in this world and not recognize a single landmark. No mountains with familiar names, no rivers etched into history books, no coasts resembling the outlines on our maps. Just strange forests, wide wetlands, frozen southlands, and seas without borders. A traveler in the Carboniferous would never know if the land ahead was continuous or if it ended in a sudden floodplain, a marsh, or a shallow sea. Every step forward was into uncertainty, and yet there was beauty in that uncertainty. The Carboniferous world map was not just a geography, it was an atmosphere of possibility. Continents converging, ecosystems spilling across boundaries, climates clashing in juxtapositions of ice and fire, swamp and desert, shallow sea and rising mountain. The earth was painting with broad, untamed strokes, creating a canvas that life would fill with forms both fleeting and eternal. As you picture it now, the humid equator, the icy south, the blurred coasts, the merging continents, let the thought settle in you. This is the same earth you walk on today, different in shape, in air, in every visible detail, but still the same planet, still shifting beneath us, still redrawing its maps. The Carboniferous was one chapter in that long, restless story, and that brings us gently to the next layer of the story, not the shape of the land, but the nature of the air itself. Because in the Carboniferous, the atmosphere was no passive backdrop. It was a force as alive as the forests, shaping every creature, every fire, every breath. The air of the Carboniferous was not the same air you breathe now. It was thicker, richer, weighted with moisture and oxygen in proportions almost unimaginable to modern lungs. If you could step into that atmosphere for just a moment, your chest would fill too easily, every breath surging with energy, almost intoxicating. It would feel as though the very air was alive, pressing itself into you, demanding to be noticed. At the equator, the climate was warm and humid beyond modern comparison. Day after day, heat pooled beneath a sky heavy with clouds, and rain fell often, sometimes in gentle sheets, sometimes in sudden, violent storms that drenched the vast forests in minutes. Imagine lying under the canopy of a lycopsid tree, listening to the drops patter through layers of leaves before finally reaching the spongy ground, where they joined pools and rivulets that never seemed to dry. The air would cling to your skin like a second body, damp and insistent, carrying the scent of wet vegetation, rich soil, and the faint metallic tang of minerals, leaching through endless water. But this was not the whole planet. Far to the south, Gondwana edged into colder latitudes. There the same earth held glaciers that inched forward with the patience of centuries, grinding mountains into powder, leaving scars of ice across stone. Imagine standing near one of these glaciers, the air so crisp it stung your nose, the silence broken only by the deep groan of ice shifting beneath its own weight. The contrast between this frozen world and the steamy equator was startling, yet they existed together, extremes folded into the same age, a reminder that Earth has always carried contradictions. Between these poles of climate, transitional zones stretched like a patchwork quilt. In some places, dry interiors lay under skies that withheld rain for months. In others, seasonal floods brought bursts of growth that quickly sank back into quiet. It was not a stable or predictable climate. It was a restless one, constantly rearranged by the geography of continents colliding and seas withdrawing. And above it all, the atmosphere carried its own secret. Oxygen levels soared to heights that would never again be matched. Today, our atmosphere holds about 21% oxygen. During the Carboniferous, it may have risen as high as 35%. That difference might sound small, but it reshaped everything. Imagine striking a spark from a stone in that world. The tiniest ember could leap into flame, devouring the dry edges of a forest in moments. Fires were not occasional accidents. They were recurring events, as much a part of the cycle of life as rain or sun. The forests grew, oxygen filled the air, lightning struck, fires swept through, and life began again. The planet breathed in vast cycles of growth and burning. To breathe in that atmosphere would have been to feel different in your own body. Your lungs would not need to work so hard. Your movements might feel lighter, more effortless, as if the air itself was supporting you. The insects of the Carboniferous certainly noticed. Their bodies, normally limited in size by the diffusion of oxygen through their tracheal systems, grew immense. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than your arm stretched through the air, sustained by the richness of that oxygen. Millipedes as long as cars crawled through the forests, their every step powered by air that seemed almost too generous. The climate and atmosphere together created giants. Now picture the texture of a Carboniferous day at the equator. Morning mists rising from swamp forests, curling like pale ghosts around the trunks of towering trees. The sun climbing slowly, its warmth turning the mist into humidity that hung over the canopy, thick and still. By midday the air would shimmer with heat, the calls of insects rising into a chorus so constant it blurred into background. Evening storms would sweep across with sudden thunder, lightning splitting the sky, igniting fallen branches and undergrowth. And always, in the air, that sense of richness, oxygen feeding every breath, every flame, every creature. At night, the climate shifted into something quieter, but no less strange. The air cooled but did not dry. The swamps released their own breath, the scent of decay mingling with the perfume of wet leaves. Fires still smoldered in places, glowing like watchful eyes between trees. The stars above shone through a thinner haze of clouds, their light glinting on shallow pools, where amphibians stirred and insects clung to reeds. Breathing that air in the dark would have been like drinking a heavy invisible wine, heady, thick, and strangely exhilarating. The southern glaciers too had their rhythms. Summers melted the edges, filling rivers with torrents of icy water that rushed into lowlands, carving new valleys. Winters locked everything down again, the silence of frozen landscapes pressing on the land like a weight. Here, oxygen still filled the sky, but the cold tempered its excesses. Fires did not rage across the ice. Instead, the glaciers worked slowly, reshaping continents with every grinding step forward. Scientists call this the late Paleozoic Ice Age, a reminder that even when the tropics were lush, parts of Earth were locked in chill. This duality shaped the Carboniferous atmosphere as much as plants or fire. The balance between forests exhaling oxygen and glaciers trapping carbon dioxide set the stage for Earth's long dance of climate change. Speculatively, imagine standing in those forests and striking a match. Today, a match flares, burns its fuel, and dies. In the Carboniferous, that same spark might leap outward, consuming bark, leaves, whole branches, carried by an atmosphere eager to feed flame. Whole regions may have burned in sweeping wildfires, their smoke rising into the humid air, turning skies orange for days. Fire was both destroyer and regenerator, a force that cleared the ground for new growth, releasing nutrients back into the soil. The atmosphere was not just a background condition, it was an active participant in life's drama. And yet, despite these dangers, this climate and atmosphere created abundance. Plants grew in such density that whole landscapes became carbon sinks, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and locking it away as peat, which would one day compress into coal. Amphibians thrived in the swampy warmth, their bodies finding endless niches in rivers and floodplains. Insects reached monstrous sizes, pushing the boundaries of biology. Every aspect of life was shaped by the air itself, as if the planet had decided to experiment with excess. If you were to walk through such a world, you would feel it in every sense. The damp press of humidity against your skin, the constant buzzing of insects amplified by their sheer size, the scent of vegetation so thick it seemed to coat your throat, the strange brilliance of fire igniting too easily, too quickly, and the heaviness of oxygen, a silent presence in every breath. The Carboniferous climate was not gentle, but it was fertile. It was a paradox, fire and flood, ice and steam, destruction and abundance. Earth was both generous and volatile, offering lush forests while threatening to burn them, nurturing swamps while carving glaciers. The atmosphere itself was a sculptor, shaping the possibilities of life, forcing it into forms we would struggle to recognize now. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: the very air that made the Carboniferous so alive also set its limits. When oxygen levels eventually fell, the giants shrank, the forests receded, and the world turned into something new. The climate was never stable. It was a rhythm, a cycle, a restless breath, and for millions of years it filled the planet with a dreamlike abundance, a green cathedral under skies that burned too easily, a world where the air itself was both gift and threat. As we leave behind this air thick with oxygen and storms, let us step now into the forests themselves, for it is one thing to speak of climate and atmosphere, but another to walk beneath the towering trees that drew that oxygen from the sky and built the strange green labyrinth of the Carboniferous. Step into the Carboniferous forest, and the first sensation to meet you is scale. The trees rise so high that your neck aches to follow them. Lycopsids, with trunks wider than a small house, lift their scaled bark upward until the canopy vanishes into haze. Their crowns spread like living chandeliers, each one splitting into branches that carried whorls of needle-like leaves. Some stood 30 meters tall, rivaling today's modern oaks and even surpassing many pines. But these giants were not like any tree you know. They bore cones filled with spores instead of seeds, and their roots spread outward in strange patterns, weaving mats across the swampy ground rather than plunging deep into the soil. Beneath them grew giant horsetails, calamites, forming thickets that rattled in the breeze. Imagine stalks as thick as your arm, rising 10 meters tall, jointed and hollow like bamboo, each segment glistening with dew. When the wind swept across them, they would have sounded like reeds in an immense organ, a chorus of whispering tones rising from every direction. Around their bases sprawled seed ferns, their fronds spreading in patterns of lace, catching the dim light that trickled down from above. The atmosphere inside this forest was heavy, as though the air itself had become part of the vegetation. Moisture clung to your skin, your hair, even your eyelashes. Every breath carried the dense perfume of life, wet bark, decomposing leaves, the earthy musk of peat. It was not an empty air, but one filled with spores, drifting like invisible pollen clouds, coating the lungs of every creature that dared to pass through. You might brush your hand across a trunk and find your palm damp, streaked with a greenish film of mosses and algae clinging to the surface. Light here was scarce. The canopy blocked most of the sun, allowing only fractured beams to reach the ground. Imagine standing at the base of those lycopsids, with their trunks like endless columns, and seeing the sky reduced to slivers of brightness far overhead. The forest floor was a twilight world, dim and humid, where roots tangled together in mats, and small pools reflected what little light they could capture. Insects scuttled in the shadows, their bodies glinting when they crossed a shaft of sunlight. Amphibians lurked among the roots, their slick skin blending with the damp ground. Every sound was softened by the wetness. The call of an amphibian carried like a hollow flute, muffled by the dense vegetation. The flutter of wings overhead was a whisper, not a rush. Yet the forest was never silent. Constant dripping echoed, water falling from canopy to leaf, from leaf to frond, from frond to ground. The noise of insects was unending, a droning hum, broken only by the occasional heavy flutter of something larger moving through the shadows. The ground beneath your feet was not firm in the way you might expect. It gave slightly with each step, spongy and uneven, formed by layer upon layer of fallen plants that never fully decomposed. Imagine the texture of peat underfoot, springy yet dense, releasing a faint squelch as water seeped upward from hidden pools. Beneath that soft surface, organic matter was slowly being pressed, compacted, stored. Over millions of years, these layers would transform into the coal seams that power much of our modern civilization. The energy of the Carboniferous forests still hums in the engines of today, each flicker of a coal flame, a whisper from these swamps. The forests themselves were ecosystems of staggering abundance. Lycopsids dominated the canopy, but they were joined by towering chordates, early relatives of conifers. Their long strap-like leaves swayed in the breeze, releasing a dry resinous scent that mingled with the musk of ferns and the damp rot of fallen trunks. Together they created layers of green, each tier filled with different life. In the dim understory, mosses grew thick, covering stones, roots, and fallen logs with carpets of emerald softness. Fungi sprouted in odd bulbous shapes, breaking down whatever plant matter the wetness allowed them to touch. Speculatively, imagine wandering into one of these forests after a heavy storm. The air would be so saturated with water that your clothes would cling instantly to your skin. Droplets hung from every leaf, sparkling in the fractured light like jewels. The silence after the thunder would be eerie, broken only by the plop of water falling into unseen pools. Somewhere nearby, The massive body of a millipede, the length of a small car, might rustle through the undergrowth, its countless legs brushing against ferns in a ripple of motion. Above, dragonflies with wings wider than dinner plates skimmed through the air, their translucent wings catching what little sunlight pierced the canopy. The forests of the Carboniferous were not simply scenery, they were engines. Each tree, each fern, each horsetail pulled carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, building an atmosphere that reshaped the entire planet. These forests created abundance not just for themselves but for everything that lived alongside them. They were the lungs of Earth, exhaling oxygen into a sky that had never known such richness. And yet, these forests were fragile. Their roots did not plunge deep, they spread across shallow, swampy soils. A shift in water levels could topple giants. Fires, though devastating, often swept through, clearing wide patches and allowing new growth. Every tree, every fern, was part of a larger cycle of growth and collapse. The forest floor, thick with peat, recorded these cycles in layer after layer, each one a page in Earth's deep memory. To walk through the Carboniferous forest was to enter a world that felt endless. Imagine walking for days, weeks, months, and never leaving the trees behind. Each horizon promised more of the same: towering lycopsids, whispering horsetails, sprawling ferns. Rivers cut through them, wide and slow, their surfaces reflecting trunks and leaves like green glass. In the evenings, mist rose from the ground, curling around the trunks until the forest looked like a dream painted in fog. At night, the forest transformed. The chorus of insects became louder, filling the air with a steady thrum. Amphibians called to one another across the swamp, their voices echoing like distant horns. The glow of fireflies, perhaps brighter in oxygen-rich air, flickered between trees, tiny stars against the vast darkness of the canopy. Breathing that air in the night would feel thick, damp, and strangely energizing, as though the very act of inhaling was enough to light a spark inside you. Speculatively, perhaps this was the most dreamlike quality of all, the sense that the forest was not simply a place, but a living cathedral. The trunks were its columns, the canopy its ceiling, the mist its incense. Every rustle of fern or drip of water was part of its liturgy, and the creatures within it were both congregation and choir. To step into it was to feel small, to feel temporary, to feel as though you had entered into a world that did not notice you and did not need to. And yet, despite its indifference, the Carboniferous forest left a legacy that would outlast it by hundreds of millions of years. Every fallen tree, every decayed fern, every collapsed horsetail added to the layers of peat that sank into the swamp. Over time, heat and pressure would transform these remains into coal, storing away the energy of a world that no longer exists. When we burn coal today, we are not just releasing carbon, we are awakening the ghost of this forest. Every flame, every spark is a fragment of sunlight captured in those towering trees, released again after 300 million years. The great forests of the Carboniferous were more than ecosystems, they were alchemists, turning sunlight into carbon, carbon into fuel, fuel into the very structure of our present. Without them, the story of human civilization, powered by coal, reshaped by industry, would look entirely different. But here, in this moment of imagining, they remain alive. Stretching endlessly across swamps, their canopies blotting out the sun, their roots binding the soil, their bodies exhaling oxygen into the sky. They are forests without end, green labyrinths where time itself seems to move differently. You could lose yourself in them, and perhaps, in a way, you already have, for their legacy runs through the air you breathe, the power you use, the history you inherit, and as the mist curls around those ancient trunks, as the hum of insects and the drip of water fill the air, you realize that these forests are not gone. They are simply transformed, written into stone, coal, and memory, waiting always for those who wish to wander back into them. Beneath the towering canopy of the Carboniferous forest, the world shifted into something entirely different. Up above, trees stretched into the haze, their crowns drinking in sunlight and pouring oxygen into the air. But below, at ground level, the forest lived in shadow. The air here was cooler, thicker, pressed down by the weight of vegetation. What little light managed to pierce the canopy broke into faint green shafts that illuminated patches of moss and tangled roots before fading into gloom. The first sensation you would notice stepping into this realm is the dampness. Every surface was wet, bark, soil, stone, even the very air felt saturated. Your feet would sink into soft ground, waterlogged and spongy with half-decayed plant matter. With each step, the earth seemed to sigh, releasing bubbles of trapped gas from below. The smell earthy and sharp like peat and iron. The silence here was heavy, not empty but muffled, as though the forest floor swallowed sound before it could travel far. Yet it was not truly silent. From the shadows came subtle noises, the faint rustle of something crawling, the drip of water from roots above, the low croak of an unseen amphibian echoing through the stillness. If you listened closely, you might catch the faint clicking of insect mandibles or the wet slap of a tail against water. The forest floor was alive with movement, but it was hidden, secretive, cloaked in shadow. Roots twisted across the ground in endless tangles, forming natural walls and pathways. Some roots rose into arches, others knotted together in dense mats that seemed almost impenetrable. Between them, mosses spread in cushions of green velvet, soaking up the constant moisture. Fungi sprouted in bizarre shapes, tall, thin stalks with bulbous caps, flat fans spreading across rotting wood, even luminous patches that glowed faintly in the dimness, casting a ghostly light. Among these damp corridors moved the first explorers of land, amphibians. Some were small, no larger than a modern frog, slipping quietly through pools and crevices. Others grew as large as crocodiles, with wide, flat skulls and bodies designed for both water and land. Imagine watching one rise slowly from a swampy pool, its eyes glistening like dark stones, its skin wet and glistening, mottled to match the dappled shadows. It would creep forward in silence, moving its limbs in slow, deliberate motions, pausing to listen, to breathe, before vanishing again into the gloom. Insects, too, ruled this hidden world. Gigantic millipedes, their bodies segmented and armored, crawled across the roots, their countless legs rippling like waves as they moved. Each step made a faint clicking sound on the damp wood, a rhythm that echoed softly in the silence. Dragonflies as large as hawks occasionally dipped beneath the canopy, their wings making a low, steady thrum before vanishing back into the air above. Giant scorpions lurked in the shadows, their pincers scraping softly against bark as they searched for prey. The forest floor was not a safe place, but it was a place of abundance. Imagine crouching down, close to the soil. The air near the ground would be warmer, filled with the smell of rot and fungus. Tiny creatures, early insects, arachnids, and amphibian larvae wriggled through the wet earth, disappearing into dark burrows. Water pooled in hollows between roots, their surfaces trembling as unseen creatures disturbed them from below. Every patch of mud, every shadow beneath a fern was alive with hidden motion. And yet, despite the abundance of life, there was an eerie quality to this underworld. The lack of sunlight, The muffled sounds, the constant dampness, it all combined to create an atmosphere both dreamlike and claustrophobic. You could not see far in any direction. Every step forward felt uncertain, as if the forest floor might give way into water, or as if something unseen might shift in the shadows. Speculatively, walking here would have felt like entering a green labyrinth. Paths twisted between roots and moss, closing behind you as mist settled back into place. The air was thick, almost too rich to breathe comfortably, carrying spores and the scent of decay. The forest seemed endless, yet it offered no clear direction. To wander beneath the canopy was to surrender to its maze, to move slowly and carefully, listening to the small sounds that hinted at unseen company. This underworld also carried its own rhythm of life and death. Fallen trees lay across the ground, their trunks slowly being consumed by fungi and insects, their bark peeled back to reveal networks of tunnels carved by creatures hidden within. Pools filled with rotting leaves became nurseries for amphibians, their eggs glistening in clusters beneath the water's surface. Predators patrolled these spaces, scorpions as waiting, motionless until something stirred, amphibians striking out with sudden speed, dragonflies swooping low to snatch prey from the air. The atmosphere itself deepened the strangeness. High oxygen levels made even small fires dangerous, yet the wetness of the forest floor kept flame at bay. Instead, the danger came from the creatures themselves. A brush of movement at your ankle might be nothing more than a small insect, or it might be the ripple of a millipede longer than your body. A splash in the distance could be the leap of a frog-sized amphibian, or the slide of something larger, heavier, dragging itself back into the water. And always above you the forest loomed. The roots were only the beginning. Looking up through the dim light, you might see trunks vanishing into mist, their sheer size making you feel small, almost insignificant. The canopy above seemed like another world entirely, bright sunlit, filled with air and space, while here below everything was dense, close, and pressing. At night, the underworld changed again. The dim shafts of sunlight vanished, replaced by darkness broken only by faint glows, patches of bioluminescent fungi, the flicker of fireflies, the shimmer of water under starlight filtering faintly through gaps. The sounds grew louder, amphibians called in chorus, deep croaks, and trills echoing through the swamp. Insects droned, their wings producing a steady vibration that seemed to seep into the ground. Large creatures moved with more confidence, their footsteps heavy and deliberate in the darkness. To sleep in this world would have been nearly impossible. Every sound suggested motion, every rustle hinted at something watching, and yet there was beauty too, the shimmer of water reflecting the faint glow of fungi, the hush of mist rolling through roots, the steady rhythm of the forest breathing around you. It was a place that pressed upon the senses, overwhelming but unforgettable. Speculatively, if you could have wandered here long enough, you might have felt the labyrinth itself was alive. The roots seemed to twist with intent, the fungi to glow in patterns, the calls of creatures to form an unbroken chant. Perhaps it would have felt as though the forest was not simply a collection of trees and animals, but a single living being, vast, green, and breathing. Every drip, every rustle, every croak was part of its voice, and you were only a small visitor passing through. The life beneath the canopy of the Carboniferous was unlike anything that has existed since. It was dense, alien, and strange, filled with creatures shaped by oxygen and dampness, by shadows and cycles of decay. To us it would feel otherworldly, perhaps unsettling, but it was the foundation of the ecosystems we know today. Amphibians would give rise to reptiles, insects would evolve into endless forms, fungi would continue their quiet work of breaking down and renewing. Here, in this twilight world of moss and roots, of insects and amphibians, life experimented. Some forms would succeed and carry forward into new ages. Others would vanish, leaving only fossils pressed into stone. But in that moment, in the shadowed labyrinth of the Carboniferous forest floor, it was a world alive with possibility, damp, eerie, and unforgettable. In the shadows of the Carboniferous forests, the air shimmered with wings. This was an age of giants, but not of the kind most people imagine. No towering dinosaurs, yet no mammoths thundering across plains. The titans of this time were smaller in form, yet immense for what they were. Insects and arthropods, swollen to sizes that seem impossible now, their very bodies shaped by the oxygen-rich atmosphere. Imagine pausing in the half-light of a swampy clearing. The air is damp, heavy, almost buzzing with its own thickness. Suddenly, a shadow passes over you, larger than any bird you know, but beating with a slow, steady rhythm that sounds like silk tearing in great, deliberate strokes. Above you, a dragonfly, Meganura, glides through the mist. Its wings stretch nearly 3 feet across, catching the fractured sunlight and turning it into flashes of silver and green. The creature dips, hovers, and with a sudden dart seizes another insect mid-flight, its mandibles closing with a sound like the crunch of dry bark. To witness this was to see Earth itself testing the boundaries of possibility. In today's world, insects are bound by limits. Their breathing relies on passive diffusion through delicate tubes, and oxygen can only travel so far. But in the Carboniferous, when the atmosphere brimmed with oxygen far beyond modern levels, those limits stretched. Dragonflies grew into hawks of the forest air, their compound eyes scanning from above, their wings slicing through air made generous by chemistry. On the ground, another giant stirred, arching across the forest floor, brushing against roots and moss. A millipede as long as a small car crept slowly forward. This was Arthropleura, a titan of the undergrowth. Its armored body shone with a faint sheen, each segment moving in perfect ripple, hundreds of legs carrying it with quiet determination. Imagine the sound, a faint rustling, a crackle of leaf litter under hundreds of feet, moving in synchrony. Its body was broad enough to block narrow passages, its shadow long enough to unsettle even the amphibians lurking nearby. And yet, this creature was not a predator, but a grazer, feeding on fallen plant matter, breaking down the endless litter of the forests into nutrients. If you dared to follow it, you might notice how its path reshaped the forest floor. Its bulk flattened mosses and pressed impressions into the spongy peat. Pools rippled as its legs disturbed the water's edge. Smaller insects scattered before it, their bodies glittering like fragments of metal in the dim light. To see it pass was to feel the ground itself come alive, as though the forest had grown legs and decided to move. Elsewhere, in the damp shadows, hunters waited. Giant scorpions, some nearly a meter long, crept across the soil. Their pincers opened and closed with soft clicks, testing the air, the ground, the vibrations of unseen prey. Their bodies were armored in glossy plates, their stingers arching above them like curved daggers glistening in the gloom. Imagine the stillness as one waited in the shadow of a root, unmoving, its eyes catching the faint glint of bioluminescent fungi. Then a sudden strike, a snap of pincers, a twitch of legs. The forest floor's silence was broken only by the brief struggle of something caught. To encounter such creatures would have been both terrifying and mesmerizing. Imagine standing knee-deep in swamp water, only to hear the slow rustle of Arthropleura moving through the undergrowth, or the heavy drone of a dragonfly sweeping above you. The size of these animals alone would have unsettled you. A dragonfly with wings broader than your shoulders, a scorpion longer than your arm, a millipede stretching into the distance. They belonged more to dream or nightmare than to reality. And yet, in the Carboniferous, they were common. The richness of oxygen allowed Earth to sculpt monsters from the ordinary. Wings stretched wider, bodies grew heavier, mandibles thickened. Every evolutionary path seemed exaggerated, as though life itself was intoxicated by the air. Even small creatures seemed sharper, stranger. Beetles gleamed with iridescent shells the size of a hand. Spiders stretched across webs that glistened like silver ropes in the humid air. Crickets chirped with a resonance deeper and louder than anything you'd hear on a summer night today. But size was not the only strange quality. Behavior, too, took on an alien cast in this atmosphere. Imagine the soundscape of a Carboniferous evening, the steady, droning buzz of dragonfly wings overhead, amplified by their size, the low hiss of scorpions moving across bark, the constant rustle of millipedes brushing through ferns. It would not have been quiet or still. The forest hummed with motion, a living orchestra of alien sounds echoing through shadowed corridors. Speculatively, perhaps this was how Earth itself expressed its chemistry. The atmosphere poured oxygen into every living thing, and the result was not just larger bodies, but a different kind of presence. Creatures moved with confidence, fed by air that filled them too easily. Fire flickered more readily, as though the planet itself was eager to see growth balanced by destruction. It was a world where chemistry was destiny, where even insects were allowed to reach the scale of predators. Picture yourself crouching low, watching a dragonfly rest upon a fern. Its body glistened in the damp light, segmented and armored, its compound eyes reflecting the world in 1,000 tiny mirrors. The veins of its wings were etched like stained glass, delicate yet strong. When it lifted again into the air, the force of its movement stirred the ferns around you, a wind created by nothing more than wings. To feel that gust on your face would remind you how immense even a single insect could be in this time. Now imagine walking through a clearing after rain. The air is still dripping, heavy with mist. From the undergrowth, Arthropleura emerges, its body arching as it climbs across a fallen log. Its bulk creaks against wood, leaving behind trails of crushed moss. In that moment, it does not feel like an insect at all, but like a living piece of the forest itself, a rolling wall of segments and legs. You might feel both awe and unease, knowing it has no interest in you, yet unable to ignore its scale. And somewhere in the shadows, scorpions hunt, their bodies low to the ground, their stingers poised. They move with eerie silence, every step deliberate. The sound of their pincers clicking is faint but distinct, like pebbles tapping together in the dark. To see one in the corner of your vision would be to freeze, unsure whether it had noticed you, whether you were part of its night's plans. The age of giants among insects and arthropods was not a time of comfort. It was a time of excess, of biology pushed to its edges. To us, these creatures seem monstrous, but to the Carboniferous, they were natural, even necessary. They broke down plants, they hunted smaller animals, they filled the forests with motion. They were part of the great experiment of life under oxygen's spell. Speculatively, perhaps if the atmosphere had remained that rich, Earth's history would have been written differently. Instead of mammals rising to dominate, perhaps the world would have remained in the grip of these giants. Imagine cities designed not for humans, but for dragonflies the size of hawks, for millipedes longer than buses, for scorpions that could stalk with the power of wolves. A planet where the hum of wings replaced the roar of engines, where the forests echoed not with our voices, but with the clicking and rustling of arthropod titans. But the atmosphere changed, as it always does. Oxygen levels fell, and with them the giants dwindled. The dragonflies shrank to the size we know today, their wings still beautiful, but no longer vast. Arthropleura disappeared entirely, leaving only faint fossil tracks pressed into stone. The giant scorpions gave way to smaller cousins, still formidable, but never again so immense. The age of giants passed, leaving behind whispers in coal beds, impressions in rock, and a sense of wonder in those who study their remains. Yet here, in this moment of imagination, they still live. The dragonflies still skim through shafts of sunlight, their wings stirring the air. The millipedes still ripple across the moss, their countless legs moving like waves. The scorpions still prowl, their stingers gleaming in the shadows. This was Earth's experiment, a brief chapter when insects and arthropods ruled as giants, their bodies grown vast not by magic but by chemistry. And as you imagine standing among them, you might feel both wonder and humility. For these were not monsters from myths, but real creatures, born of real air, shaped by real forests. They remind us that Earth has always been capable of strangeness, that life has always been ready to stretch its boundaries, to see how far it could go. The age of giants was one such moment, terrifying, awe-inspiring, unforgettable. The strangeness of the Carboniferous giants was not the result of magic or accident, but of air itself. To understand why dragonflies grew with wingspans wider than a child's arm, why millipedes stretched the length of a small car, why scorpions stalked the swamps like armored wolves, you must first understand how insects breathe. Unlike us, with lungs that draw air deep into our bodies, insects breathe through networks of tubes, tracheae, that branch through the tissues. Oxygen does not travel with the push of a heartbeat, but by simple diffusion, slipping along gradients from the outside world into the cells that need it. In today's atmosphere, with only 21% oxygen, this system sets firm limits. There is only so far oxygen can travel before it is spent. Only so large an insect can grow before its own body suffocates from within. But in the Carboniferous, the air was richer. 30 to 35% oxygen filled every breath, every space, every pool of air trapped in the roots of the forest. In that abundance, the boundaries of biology stretched. Oxygen seeped farther into tissues, reaching places it could not reach today. Diffusion worked more efficiently, allowing insects to grow not just longer but stronger, not just wider but heavier. The atmosphere itself was their ally, inflating their forms into something extraordinary. Speculatively, imagine the feeling of breathing in that air yourself. Each breath would feel effortless, almost intoxicating, as though the air were too light, too quick to fill you. Now imagine that same abundance working its way through the bodies of insects, fueling them beyond their usual scale. Wings could beat heavier and still hold aloft. Legs could grow thicker and still carry weight. Bodies could stretch longer and still survive. Life was being sculpted not only by evolution, but by chemistry. This was the secret of the age of giants, Earth's own breath. The forests, vast and endless, exhaled oxygen into the sky, and that oxygen poured into every creature, inflating possibilities that in other times could never exist. The atmosphere was not a passive backdrop, but an active participant in evolution. Every dragonfly wing, every millipede segment, every scorpion's armored plate was written by air as much as by DNA. and what a world it made. The forests seemed alive not only with greenery, but with motion on an exaggerated scale. Wings buzzed louder, shadows stretched longer, bodies pressed heavier into the soil. To stand there would be to feel surrounded by life swollen beyond measure, as though the forest had decided to amplify every note in its symphony. Speculatively, if oxygen had remained so high, perhaps our world would have been very different. Imagine a planet still ruled by colossal insects, their forms refined over millions of years. Dragonflies the size of falcons hunting in packs, weaving patterns across the sky. Millipedes longer than buses moving in herds, their bodies creating rolling shadows over the land. Scorpions with stingers as long as swords, their armor gleaming like bronze in the humid air. Mammals, perhaps, would never have had the chance to rise. Their lungs too clumsy, their forms too inefficient in a world where diffusion was enough. The age of mammals might never have dawned. The earth might still be an insect's empire. But oxygen levels did not stay that high. The forests shifted, climates cooled, and the atmosphere thinned back to a balance closer to our own. As the air changed, the giants dwindled. Dragonflies shrank, millipedes vanished, scorpions retreated into smaller, quieter forms. What seemed so natural in one age became impossible in the next, a reminder that evolution is never a straight path, but a dialogue between life and environment, between body and air. The fossils we find today, wings pressed into stone, trackways carved into ancient peat, are whispers of that dialogue. They tell us of a time when Earth itself lifted the limits, when life swelled to match the chemistry of the sky. Each impression, each fragment is a reminder that the giants were not accidents, but inevitabilities, born from a world that invited them to grow. And so, when we imagine them, the dragonflies skimming through beams of light, the millipedes rippling through moss, the scorpions gleaming in shadow, we are also imagining the air itself. For without that atmosphere, without the forests that created it, without the chemistry that filled every breath, the age of giants could never have been. It was Earth's great experiment in size, written not by fantasy, but by the quiet, invisible presence of oxygen. Where the waters of the Carboniferous swamps deepened into lakes and rivers, another dynasty thrived. The air above belonged to the insects, the undergrowth to arthropod giants. But in the shallows and streams, amphibians reigned. These were not the small, fragile creatures we know today, croaking in ditches or slipping quietly through ponds. The amphibians of this age were rulers, many of them as large as modern crocodiles. Their forms varied, their experiments strange, their presence undeniable. Imagine kneeling at the edge of a swamp pool as dusk settles. The water lies dark and still, reflecting the trunks of towering leucopsids and the flicker of fireflies drifting above. Then, with a sudden ripple, the surface breaks. A massive head rises, wide and flat, its eyes shining like coins in the dim light. This is no crocodile, though it carries the same aura of patient strength. Its skull is broad, its jaws lined with teeth suited for gripping prey, and its body stretches back into the water, half-hidden, powerful, and alien. These were the labyrinthodons, named for the intricate patterns of their teeth. Some stretched 2 or 3 meters long, their bodies armored with scales, their limbs thick and muscular. They were ambush predators, lying in wait among reeds and roots, their nostrils barely above the waterline. When an insect skimmed too close, or a smaller amphibian strayed near, they would surge forward in a sudden explosion of muscle and water, jaws snapping shut with a force that echoed across the swamp. The splash would settle, ripples spreading across the pool, and once again stillness would reign. Others were stranger still. Some had skulls shaped like boomerangs, wide and flat as if pressed under the weight of the earth itself. Their eyes perched atop their heads like watchful bulbs, perfect for lurking just beneath the surface. Imagine standing in ankle-deep water, looking down and realizing that the stone beneath your feet is a skull, its owner waiting silently for the right moment to move. Not all were hunters of size and power. The Carboniferous swamps also held delicate forms, salamander-like creatures with slender bodies, feathery external gills, and limbs suited for both water and land. They crept quietly among roots and moss, feeding on insects too small for their giant cousins to notice. These smaller amphibians added texture to the ecosystem, filling niches, shaping the food web. The air around the waters carried their voices. Croaks, trills, and bellows echoed across the forests at night, a chorus of amphibians calling through the mist. Imagine lying in the dark and hearing them, deep, resonant booms from the giants in the rivers, sharp chirps from the smaller forms in the shallows. Together they created a soundscape unlike any other age, a living music that spoke of dominance, abundance, and constant presence. Speculatively, to walk the banks of a Carboniferous river would have been to feel watched. The still water betrayed nothing, but beneath the surface lay eyes, bodies, jaws. Every ripple could mean a predator shifting. Every silence could mean one waiting. The amphibians were not confined to water alone. Many could crawl onto land, dragging their heavy bodies across mud, their bellies leaving long streaks behind them. Some patrolled between pools, their movements slow but steady, their bodies glistening in the humid air. To encounter one on land would be to confront an animal as long as you were tall, its head wide and alien, its eyes unblinking. Their dominance was not just about size. The amphibians of the Carboniferous were experimental forms, trying shapes and strategies that seem almost fantastical to us. Some carried armor plating, ridged and ridged again, as though expecting dangers unknown. Others had elongated bodies with tiny limbs, more eel than frog, slipping easily between water and land. A few bore skulls so flat and wide they seemed less like animals and more like living traps, designed to swallow anything that crossed their path. Speculatively, they were Earth's first attempt at vertebrate rulers of the land. Fish had ruled the seas, insects the air, but amphibians bridged the gap, half in water, half on land, their very existence a hinge between worlds. They explored the boundaries of possibility, asking what a vertebrate could become outside the sea. For tens of millions of years their answer was dominance. At night, when the insects hummed in chorus and the forests glowed faintly with mist, the amphibians were in their element. Picture a moonlit swamp, silver light reflecting from still pools. The air is alive with croaks, guttural and echoing, each one bouncing off the water's surface. Then a sudden crash, a dragonfly too low, seized by jaws rising from beneath. The water closes again, and silence returns, broken only by the drip of condensation from the trees above. The presence of amphibians was more than ecological. It gave the Carboniferous its mood. They were the guardians of rivers, the hidden kings of swamps, the heavy breathing bodies beneath every pool. To wander in this world was to share space with them, to sense them always nearby, half seen, half heard, but never absent. And so the amphibians held their rule. Strange, powerful, diverse, they shaped the waterways and haunted the forest edges. For this chapter of Earth's story, they were the dominant vertebrates, claiming a world still damp with its own creation. In their white skulls and echoing calls, in their armored backs and glistening skin, you can glimpse the bold experiments of evolution, a time when the planet was still deciding what it meant to live on land, and amphibians carried the answer. But beneath the reign of the amphibians, quiet changes were stirring. Not all experiments of the Carboniferous shouted with size or roared with strength. Some whispered instead, subtle and small, but destined to echo far louder than the croak of any labyrinthodont. In the damp shadows, where amphibians laid their jelly-like eggs in shallow pools, another kind of creature was beginning to free itself from the water's leash. These were the first reptiles, and their secret weapon was not teeth or claws, but an egg. Imagine crouching by a fern-covered bank, brushing away the moss to reveal something unfamiliar. Not a clutch of translucent spheres trembling with tiny gilled embryos, but a sturdier shell, sealed, self-contained. Inside it, the developing creature was protected, nourished, and, most importantly, safe from drying air. This was the amniotic egg, a small world within a world, a capsule of independence. Unlike amphibians, which could never stray too far from water, early reptiles carried their nurseries with them. They no longer had to wait for the rains, or for the swamps to flood, or for chance pools to hold their fragile young. They could wander onto drier ground, into forests, across plains, into territories amphibians could not claim. It was not a dramatic leap, no sudden conquest of new landscapes. It was quiet, patient, inevitable, and in that quietness lay revolution. Picture one of the first reptiles, small, lizard-like, its scales shining faintly in the humid air. Its body is no larger than your hand, but its stride is deliberate. Where amphibians lumbered clumsily on land, dragging heavy bodies across mud, this creature moves with confidence. Its limbs are stronger, its body lighter, its skin armored against drying. When it stops to rest, it does not need the safety of water. When it finds a patch of soft earth, it lays its eggs directly in the soil, covering them with moss and leaves. No pond, no stream, no tether to the amphibian's world. The change is so subtle that to watch it unfold, you might miss it. Yet in that small act of laying an egg on dry ground, the path to all future vertebrates was opened. Dinosaurs would one day thunder across continents because of this. Birds would one day beat their wings across skies because of this. Mammals, and humans among them, would one day nurse their young in burrows and dens because of this. All of it began with the quiet independence of the amniotic egg. The forest itself would have borne witness. Imagine a clearing at dawn, the mist still rising from the swamp. Amphibians croak loudly from the water, their bodies half submerged. In the shadows at the edge, unnoticed, a reptile digs into the soil with delicate claws, leaving behind a buried clutch. No sound, no fanfare, and yet this moment weighs more heavily on the scales of history than all the booming calls from the swamp. Speculatively, the amphibians may never have sensed the threat. They ruled by presence and size, but evolution does not always reward the loudest rulers. Sometimes it rewards the quietest innovations. The amphibians kept their dominion, hunting and croaking and dragging their bodies across the banks, unaware that in their very shadow the future was being written. To walk in that world would have been to sense layers of time folding together. On the surface, the amphibians, immense and confident. Beneath, the reptiles, small, fragile, but carrying within them a promise. The air itself seemed to nourish both, the amphibians swelling in abundance, the reptiles whispering of possibilities yet to come. Speculatively, if you had picked up one of those early eggs, cradling it in your hand, You might have felt its shell warm against your skin, its weight strangely reassuring. Inside, an entire revolution waited, silent and unseen. That egg was not just a nursery. It was a key, a way out of the swamps, a way into the drylands, a way toward the endless forms of vertebrates yet to come. This was the hidden revolution of the Carboniferous, not as dramatic as the giant dragonflies, not as imposing as the crocodile-sized amphibians, but more lasting than either. It was the quiet invention that ensured life would not remain bound to water, that vertebrates could step fully onto land and stay there. It was the first true step toward the future, and so in the hush of that ancient forest, with mist rising, insects buzzing, and amphibians booming across the swamps, the reptiles carried their secret. Small bodies, quiet eggs, unremarkable in their time, yet from them the story of Earth would turn. The Carboniferous swamps were kingdoms of abundance. To wander through them was to enter a living ocean of green, where trees rose like pillars in endless ranks, their crowns meeting to form a canopy that stretched to every horizon. Pools mirrored the trunks in their still water. Ferns carpeted every open space. Mist drifted like pale curtains between the roots. It felt eternal, as though this green world had always existed and would always endure. Yet beneath the surface of such magnificence lay fragility. These swamps, vast as they were, lived in balance with their climate. They depended on warmth, on rains that came often and heavy, on water that gathered in shallow basins and fed the roots of lycopsids, horsetails, and seed ferns. Their very abundance made them delicate. A swamp was paradise only so long as the water remained. If the rains faltered, if the air grew cooler or the seas pulled back, the system began to unravel. Imagine stepping into such a swamp during its height. The air is heavy, thick with oxygen and humidity. Each breath fills you with the scent of wet leaves, peat, and decay. Beneath your feet, the ground squelches, water seeping between mats of roots. Everywhere you look, life crowds in. Moss climbing over roots, fungi sprouting from bark, dragonflies humming above stagnant pools. It feels unstoppable, a tide of green pressing outward in every direction. But now imagine a shift. The air grows drier, the rains come less often, pools shrink, the spongy ground begins to harden. The trees, dependent on constant water, falter. Their shallow roots dry, their trunks crack, the canopy thins. Light pierces the forest floor in harsh shafts, drying the moss, exposing bare patches of soil. The insects that once thrived in the damp labyrinth lose their shelter. Amphibians, their skin needing water, retreat to shrinking pools. The swamp, once endless, begins to collapse inward. This was the hidden truth of the Carboniferous. Abundance was never guaranteed. Every patch of forest balanced on conditions that could shift with the tilt of continents, with the rise of mountains, with the cooling of air. And when those conditions changed, the swamps fell. Speculatively, walking through such a dying swamp would have felt unsettling. The air, once thick with the hum of insects, would be quieter. The pools, once filled with amphibian calls, would lie still and empty. Fallen trunks would not be quickly swallowed by moss and fungi, but would lie exposed, drying, cracking under the sun. Fires, fed by the high oxygen, would spread more easily across dry litter, reducing swathes of forest to ash. In place of abundance, there would be silence, barrenness, absence, and with that absence came extinctions. The giants of the Carboniferous, the dragonflies, the millipedes, the amphibians, all depended on the swamps. Their lives were tied to the humidity, to the constant water, to the dense forests. As the swamps shrank, so too did their empires. Populations dwindled, species vanished, and the once unshakable abundance proved temporary after all. The lesson of these swamps is as haunting as it is beautiful. Life can build worlds of unimaginable richness, but those worlds are fragile, dependent on balances too delicate to last forever. The Carboniferous forests created our coal, exhaled our oxygen, filled the planet with abundance, and yet they too fell to shifts in climate. At night, in the age of their strength, the swamps must have seemed eternal. The air would glow faintly with fireflies, the pools alive with croaks and splashes. Mist would rise from the ground, curling around the trunks like breath. But when the climate shifted, those same nights would have been filled with absence, the fireflies fewer, the calls muted, the mist thinner. The forest's song faded, one note at a time, until silence spread where once there had been a symphony. Speculatively, perhaps this is why their memory lingers so strongly. The swamps remind us that paradise is not permanent, that life's abundance is always at the mercy of climate, of water, of balance. Their fragility was their story as much as their grandeur. And so, when you imagine the Carboniferous swamps, endless, green, humid, alive, hold also the image of their collapse. For in their rise and fall lies one of Earth's deepest truths. Nothing, no matter how vast or magnificent, endures unchanged. When the forests of the Carboniferous fell, they did not vanish completely. Their trunks, their fronds, their roots and spores, all that living green, sank into the swamps they had once ruled. Layer upon layer of plant matter piled up, pressed into the wet earth. In today's world, such remains would quickly decompose, consumed by fungi and bacteria, returned to the cycle of soil and air. But in the Carboniferous, the conditions were different. The wetlands were too wet, too low in oxygen, too smothered for decay to finish its work. And so the forests stayed, not in the form of living trees, but as mats of half-rotted peat, thick and spongy, buried by time and sediment. Imagine stepping onto such a mat while it was still new. Your foot would sink, the ground yielding like a soaked sponge. Beneath the surface, the layers were already darkening, compressing under their own weight. With each passing century, the peat thickened. With each passing million years, pressure and heat worked their slow alchemy, transforming soft plant tissue into something harder, denser, coal. The process was patient, measured not in lifetimes, but in geologic ages. A fallen lycopsid tree, massive and towering, might rest for thousands of years in waterlogged silence before it began its slow descent into stone. The forests built themselves twice, once in life with green crowns rising to the sky, and once in death with black seams hidden deep in the earth. Speculatively, you might imagine these seams as the forest's second breath, waiting in silence for a future they could never have foreseen. Today, when coal is burned, it releases not only carbon but sunlight stored long ago. Every flicker of flame from a coal fire is, in truth, a piece of Carboniferous daylight, trapped in trunks and fronds, released once more into the world. A lantern lit on a miner's helmet, the glow of a coal furnace, the hum of a power plant, each carries within it the whisper of swamp forests drowned 300 million years ago. The scale of this legacy is almost impossible to grasp. Entire landscapes of coal stretch beneath modern continents, black rivers of compressed history running through stone. In Britain, in Appalachia, in China and Australia, seams lie buried, waiting. These are not random gifts, but the preserved abundance of a time when forests stretched endlessly across equatorial Earth. Imagine standing in a modern coal mine. The air is dry, dust hangs heavy, and the rock walls glisten with black seams. Run your hand across one, and you are touching the ghosts of leucopsids and horsetails, ferns and seed ferns, their tissues flattened into a carbon shadow. Hold a lump of coal in your palm, and you hold the body of a forest, condensed into stone, darker than night, older than mountains. Speculatively, perhaps there is something haunting in the thought that our civilization, with its lights and engines, is powered by the death of forests that no human ever saw alive. The Industrial Revolution began not with firewood or sunlight, but with coal, the Carboniferous returning, awakened by human hands. Steamships, locomotives, factories, all of them ran on ancient swamps turned into stone. Even now, in our digital age, coal still burns in many places, sending the breath of Carboniferous forests back into the air. Every glow of an electric bulb powered by coal, every plume rising from a smokestack is part of that ancient cycle. The forests exhaled oxygen, were buried, were transformed, and now exhale again, but this time not oxygen, but carbon, released into the modern sky. The whisper of the Carboniferous lingers not only in fossils, but in the very climate we now alter with its remnants. At night, when you see the orange flicker of coal fire, imagine it as a memory. Each spark is a glimmer of a swamp long gone, a reflection of dragonflies hovering above stagnant pools, of amphibians calling across the dark. In every ember lies the story of forests so vast they shaped the air itself, and in every plume of smoke lies the reminder that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form. Speculatively, if you were to listen closely to the crackle of coal as it burns, perhaps you might hear it whisper, not in words but in a deeper language, the hiss of steam, the sigh of carbon released, the quiet echo of rains falling on a forest floor 300 million years ago. The Carboniferous left many legacies, giant insects, amphibians, reptiles beginning their rise, but coal is the legacy that still powers us. Our lights, our industries, our history are tied to that age of swamps. We are, in a sense, children of the Carboniferous, shaped not only by its creatures, but by its buried forests, by the black seams that link us to its green abundance. And so, when you picture those endless swamps, do not think only of their collapse, think also of their persistence. For though the trees are gone, though the dragonflies are smaller, though the amphibians have retreated, the forests still live beneath us, in seams of coal, in fires, in smoke. Their story is not over. It lingers, fueling the present, shaping the future, reminding us that the past is never truly buried. The Carboniferous world breathed deeply, and with every breath it filled itself with oxygen. The forests exhaled it in torrents, flooding the sky until the air itself seemed eager, volatile, charged with hidden fire. For creatures this meant abundance, lungs and tracheae swollen with ease. But for the forests themselves, for the mosses and ferns, for the leucopsids towering above the swamps, it meant danger. Fire lurked everywhere, a predator as patient and persistent as any scorpion or amphibian. Imagine standing in a clearing at dusk, the air thick with mist. The ground is damp, the trees dripping with condensation, their roots sunk deep into waterlogged peat. By all appearances, the forest is too wet to burn. And yet, one spark, a lightning strike from a summer storm, could ripple into catastrophe. The oxygen-rich air embraced every ember, feeding it until branches cracked and flames leapt into the canopy. What began as a flicker spread like hunger, fire racing along fallen trunks, leaping from fern to fern, swallowing whole thickets of horsetails. The sound of such a blaze would have been overwhelming. Not just the crackle of wood, but the roar of oxygen rushing into flame, a low thunder rolling across the swamp. The trees, tall and hollow, may have erupted like chimneys, sending pillars of fire into the sky. Smoke billowed upward, dark and heavy, drifting in curtains across the canopy. To stand in its path would have been to feel heat press against your skin like a living force, the air shimmering, your breath filled with ash. Speculatively, whole landscapes may have burned in this way, wildfires sweeping through with terrifying regularity. Even dampness could not always protect the forests, not when the atmosphere itself was tilted toward fire. What today might smolder and die could then flare and spread. For the animals of the Carboniferous, fire was not rare. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed across centuries. And yet, fire was not only destruction, it was also renewal. When flames passed, they left behind open spaces where new growth surged upward. Seeds sprouted in the ash, nourished by minerals released in the blaze. Young forests rose quickly, racing into the gaps left by their predecessors. Fire was the scythe and the hand that planted again, the cycle of ending and beginning. The swamps themselves may have depended on these intervals of burning, their endless abundance pruned and reshaped by flame. Imagine walking through a forest weeks after such a fire. The air still smells of smoke, sharp and acrid, clinging to your throat. The trunks of leucopsids stand blackened, their bark cracked, their crowns gone. Ferns lie flattened, turned to brittle ash beneath your steps. But among the ruins, green shoots push upward. Moss creeps across charred wood. Tiny plants sprout in every patch of bare soil. The forest is quiet, emptied of the hum of insects, yet in that silence you can hear renewal, the faint rustle of new leaves unfurling, the whisper of roots reclaiming the earth. Fire made the Carboniferous forests restless, never still for long. They grew, burned, collapsed, and grew again, each cycle building new layers of peat, new seams of future coal. The very fires that devoured them ensured their memory would last, written into the stone below our feet. Speculatively, imagine what it would have felt like to live as a creature within this cycle. For an insect, the sky lit orange without warning, the air suddenly too hot to fly. For an amphibian, pools shrinking as flames licked the banks, forcing a retreat into deeper water. For a reptile, eggs hidden in soil, the heat above both danger and shield. Every life had to reckon with fire, every lineage shaped by its sudden visits. To survive meant not only enduring the forest, but enduring its burning, and there is a strange poetry in that balance. Oxygen gave the Carboniferous its giants, its abundance, its cathedral forests. But oxygen also gave it fire, and fire gave it impermanence. It was a world alive in every sense, breathing, burning, regrowing. The swamps seemed eternal, but their eternity was made of cycles, each forest rising on the ash of another. At night, when the flames died and smoke lingered, the sky would glow faintly red, embers scattered like stars across the blackened ground. Mist and ash mixed together, settling in silence. From the ruins the forest began again, the same as before, yet subtly different, shaped by fire's hand. And so the Carboniferous was dangerous, not only because of its creatures, but because of its air. To breathe there was to inhale both life and risk, abundance and volatility. Every spark was a promise of flame. Every forest was a tinderbox disguised as paradise. Fire was as much a resident of that age as dragonflies, amphibians, or reptiles. It was the hidden ruler, sweeping across landscapes, erasing and rewriting them, ensuring that the story of the Carboniferous was never one of permanence, but of change. The Carboniferous world was caught in a strange, delicate dance between its forests and its air, Every tree, every fern, every towering lycopsid breathed out oxygen in abundance. That oxygen filled the sky, feeding insects, swelling lungs, amplifying life itself. But oxygen is not passive. It is restless, eager, quick to ignite. And so the forests that exhaled life also created the conditions for their own burning. Imagine the rhythm of this balance. A forest grows thick and endless, its canopy stretching across the horizon. Its breath enriches the atmosphere, turning each sunrise into a blaze of oxygen-rich light. Insects grow vast, amphibians thrive, reptiles lay their eggs in mossy soil. The air is a gift, a constant flood of possibility. But then the cycle tilts. A lightning strike, a spark, and that same air becomes fire's accomplice. The forest that exhaled its abundance is consumed, its trunks blackened, its canopy torn away. Yet the story does not end in ash. The fire clears space, opening ground for seeds, for shoots, for saplings to rise. The air, though momentarily clouded with smoke, will once again be filled by the breath of new forests. This was the Carboniferous pattern, creation feeding destruction, destruction clearing the way for creation. A feedback loop woven into the very fabric of the age. Speculatively, if you could watch from above, you might see it as a breathing planet. Green swells outward, thick and lush, the air filling with oxygen. Then flames sweep across, smoke rising, green withdrawing. Silence follows, broken by the whisper of new growth pushing upward, reclaiming space. The planet inhales, exhales, ignites, and renews. A living rhythm, larger than any creature, larger than any forest, written into the earth itself. To walk among it would have been to feel the flux. On some days, the air so fresh it almost shimmered, heavy with oxygen, scented with damp leaves and moss. On other days, that same air would sting your throat, thick with ash, acrid and hot, the ground beneath your feet still warm from recent fire. Each forest carried within it both abundance and impermanence, both cathedral and cinder. This balance shaped everything. The insects could only be giants, because the forests created so much oxygen. The forests could only spread so vast because the fires cleared space for renewal. Amphibians and reptiles lived not only in green abundance but in landscapes freshly scarred, where ash gave rise to new growth. Nothing was separate. Each element fed into the next. Speculatively, perhaps the Carboniferous was the closest Earth has come to being alive as a single organism. The forests were its lungs, exhaling oxygen into the sky. The atmosphere was its blood, carrying breath to every creature. The fires were its fevers, burning hot, purging, and then healing. To live then was to inhabit not just a planet, but a body, vast, restless, breathing in cycles too large for any single creature to control. At night, under a sky glowing faintly with stars, you might have heard this balance as sound. The deep croaks of amphibians, the hum of insects, the distant crackle of fire somewhere unseen. Silence would follow, heavy and uncanny, before the forest's chorus began again. It was not a static world, not a fixed paradise, but one in constant motion, reshaping itself endlessly. And within that motion lay both wonder and danger. The creatures of the Carboniferous thrived because of the air, but they also lived under its shadow. Every breath was abundant, yet every spark was threat. The swamps were fertile, yet fragile. The forests were vast, yet always temporary. Speculatively, if you had lived then, you might have felt the instability in your bones. The forest never quite still, the air never quite safe, the ground never quite permanent. It was a world alive in every sense, shifting, cycling, repeating, a reminder that Earth is not a stage upon which life plays, but a partner in the dance, breathing, burning, renewing alongside its creatures. The Carboniferous balance was strange, fragile, and extraordinary. It gave us coal, oxygen, forests, giants. But more than that, it gave us a glimpse of Earth's deeper truth, that life and atmosphere are inseparable, that one creates and reshapes the other, that the planet itself is never still, but always in rhythm. While the forests breathed and the fires burned, the very bones of the planet were shifting. Deep beneath the swamps, in the hidden currents of the mantle, continents were on the move, drifting slowly inch by inch toward one another. It was a movement so gradual that no dragonfly, no amphibian, no reptile could have noticed, and yet across millions of years the changes were monumental. The scattered fragments of Earth's surface were assembling, piece by piece, into one vast body, the supercontinent we call Pangaea. Imagine looking at a Carboniferous map. To the north, ancient land masses like Laurussia and Baltica crept steadily toward each other, pressing closer. To the south, Gondwana stretched like an immense shadow drifting upward. With every collision, Earth reshaped itself, coastlines redrawn, rivers diverted, mountains pushed toward the sky. It was a slow march, but relentless, and its footsteps echoed across the climate, the forests, the lives of every creature. The meeting of continents was not quiet. When masses of stone collided, they did not merge softly. They folded and crumpled, layer upon layer of crust buckling upward into mountain ranges. The Appalachians in North America, the Urals in Russia, these were the scars of the Carboniferous, the memory of continents striking each other with unstoppable force. Imagine the ground beneath you heaving, ridges rising, slowly into the sky, valleys deepening, rocks grinding against rocks in endless friction. For millions of years, the land was restless, groaning under its own collisions. The newborn mountains towered above the swamps like walls of stone, their peaks sharp and raw, their slopes scarred by erosion. Rivers once flowing gently across plains were caught and redirected. Some were dammed into lakes, others carved new valleys, carrying silt and nutrients down to the forests below. Where once there had been flat wetlands, there were now ridges and basins, cliffs and rolling uplands. The landscape fractured, diversified, and life adapted to fill the spaces. Speculatively, imagine standing in a Carboniferous forest as the silhouette of mountains rose faintly on the horizon, peaks so new they gleamed with unweathered rock. The air would have been thick with mist, yet beyond the haze, jagged lines cut against the sky. Streams poured down their sides, frothing with white water, carrying the taste of stone. The forests at their feet drank deeply from these rivers, their roots fed by minerals pulled freshly from the earth's crust. The mountains were not just barriers, they were fountains reshaping ecosystems with every trickle, every flood. The march toward Pangaea also reshaped the climate. As continents converged, vast interiors formed, regions far from any ocean. These lands were drier, harsher, less forgiving than the humid swamps at the coasts, where amphibians and giant insects once thrived in perpetual dampness. Reptiles, with their resilient eggs and scaly skin, began to find advantage. The geography of Earth itself was preparing the stage for a new cast of creatures. Speculatively, perhaps the forests felt this change in their own way. At the edges of the swamps, where the air grew drier, trees struggled, their shallow roots less certain. In their place rose the plants better suited to dry soils, seed ferns and other pioneers of the uplands. Life shifted as the land shifted, every organism caught in the slow but inevitable consequences of drifting continents. From above, if you could have looked down with timeless eyes, the earth of the Carboniferous would have seemed like a puzzle being assembled. The pieces slid closer, locked together, and soon would form a single vast whole. Oceans narrowed, mountains rose, climates tilted. It was a process invisible in a single lifetime, but undeniable across millennia. The forests, the fires, the amphibians, the reptiles, all were part of a planet into transition, reshaping itself with tectonic breath. At night, the mountains may have glowed faintly under the stars, their peaks catching the silver of moonlight. Rivers would murmur down their slopes, carrying fragments of stone. In the swamps below, the chorus of amphibians would continue, unaware of the titanic forces rearranging their world. Yet even their voices, echoing across dark waters, were part of the same story. A planet moving toward unity, one world, whole and immense under the same sky. The march toward Pangaea was slow, steady, unstoppable. It was geology's long rhythm, echoing beneath the shorter rhythms of fire and forest, growth and collapse. It reshaped the face of the earth, prepared the ground for new ages, and gave the Carboniferous its backdrop of rising stone. As the continents pressed together, the seas retreated. Shallow waters that had once spread like silver mirrors across the land began to withdraw, their waves pulling back, their tides leaving behind mudflats and sand. Where once the horizon shimmered with inland seas stretching for hundreds of miles, now dry ground emerged, reshaping the map of the Carboniferous world. Imagine walking along such a coastline at dawn. The air is heavy with mist, the smell of salt faint but fading. Beneath your feet, the mud is cracked, its surface etched with the patterns of receding water. Shells glint faintly in the morning light. Their owners long gone as the sea withdrew. Pools remain, shallow and isolated, alive with darting fish and amphibians stranded in what was once a greater expanse. The silence feels strange, as though something vast has stepped away, leaving the land suddenly more exposed. These seas had once been havens of life, shallow, sunlit, warm. Coral reefs grew in their margins, fish darted through their waters, and swamps flourished along their edges. Their retreat was not sudden, but steady, a slow vanishing that reshaped ecosystems with quiet inevitability. Forests that had once drunk from the moisture of coastal wetlands now faced dry winds. Swamps that stretched for thousands of miles dwindled, replaced by plains and uplands. Speculatively, this retreat was the beginning of the end for the Carboniferous green world. The swamps, those vast engines of oxygen and coal, depended on water as much as they depended on sunlight. Without constant flooding, without marshy soils to cradle their shallow roots, the great leucopsids began to falter. One by one, the pillars of the forest toppled, their crowns collapsing into the mud. The insects that had thrived in perpetual dampness found fewer safe havens. Amphibians, tied to water by their very skin, faced shrinking pools. Slowly the symphony of the swamps grew quieter, and yet the retreating seas gave rise to new worlds of their own. Where water once shimmered, plains stretched outward, open and dry. Rivers carved winding paths across these fresh landscapes, their banks lined with plants better suited to arid soils, seed ferns, pioneers of a new kind of forest. Reptiles with their self-contained eggs and scaly skins began to find opportunity here, venturing where amphibians could not follow. The land was changing, and with it the balance of power. Imagine the texture of such a transition. The air, once moist and heavy, grew drier, carrying the scent of dust and stone. The sound of frogs and croaking labyrinthodons faded. replaced by the quieter rustle of reptiles slipping across the undergrowth. The ground, once soft and spongy, became firmer underfoot, the prints of insects and amphibians preserved less often in drying soils. Light fell more harshly, less filtered by the thick canopy, casting longer shadows. Speculatively, the animals themselves must have sensed the difference. For amphibians, each journey between shrinking pools was perilous, their bodies drying in the open air. For insects, fewer swamps meant fewer safe havens for breeding. But for reptiles, this was invitation, a world opening in their favor, each dry plain another foothold in the slow rise of their kind. The seas had withdrawn, and in their absence new rulers began to step forward. The coastline itself must have seemed alive, always shifting. In some places the sea advanced during wetter periods, flooding forests and creating lagoons where amphibians gathered. In others it retreated for good, leaving behind dunes and plains, where only the hardiest plants could endure. The land was not fixed, but fluid, a borderland where Earth's changing rhythms wrote new maps again and again. From above, the world would have looked like a quilt of change. Swamps here, drying plains there, shimmering seas narrowing between colliding continents, mountain ranges rising while coastlines shrank, rivers twisting, redirecting, adapting to the shifting ground. It was a planet in motion, never still, each change echoing in the lives of the creatures that depended on water, forest, and air. At night, when the tide had pulled back, the mudflats would gleam under the moon. The silence of retreat hung over them, broken only by the croak of stranded amphibians or the flutter of a dragonfly searching for a place to land. Pools reflected the stars, small fragments of water where once there had been a sea. To walk there would have been to feel the fragility of it all, the sense that the land was growing larger, but at a cost to the worlds that had thrived in water. The retreat of the seas was more than geography. It was the slow unwinding of the Carboniferous paradise. The swamps had defined the age, creating oxygen, shaping giants, writing coal into stone. But their vastness depended on shallow waters and constant floods. As the seas withdrew, the stage that had hosted the age's wonders began to shrink. The forests faltered, the swamps dwindled, and the world shifted towards something new. Speculatively, perhaps this is why the Carboniferous feels both eternal and fleeting. Eternal, because its coal and fossils remain with us, written into the earth. Fleeting, because the very conditions that created its abundance were fragile, tied to seas that would not stay. The retreat of those waters set the collapse in motion, quietly, steadily, reshaping the green labyrinth into a different earth. The Carboniferous world, once a greenhouse of swamps and endless warmth, began to shift toward an unfamiliar chill. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first the air cooled, rains fell less often, winds sharpened, and far to the south, in the vast expanse of Gondwana, ice began to gather. What had been a world of steaming jungles and oxygen-rich skies was entering one of Earth's first great ice ages. Imagine it, glaciers, white and immense, grinding across southern continents that had once been warm. Sheets of ice stretched for miles, heavy and relentless, their weight carving valleys and flattening stone. Mountains disappeared beneath frozen rivers of time, their peaks shrouded in silence. The air there was sharp, thin, and dry, so unlike the humid breath of the swamps farther north. To stand at the edge of such a glacier would have been to feel the raw force of the planet itself, cold pressing against your skin, winds carrying snow in endless drifts. This contrast, steaming swamps at the equator, Frozen deserts at the poles gave the late Carboniferous an atmosphere of extremes. The earth was divided between heat and cold, wet and dry, abundance and scarcity. Imagine walking only a few hundred miles and finding the world utterly different. In one place, amphibians croaked in misty forests, dragonflies shimmered in sunlight, and ferns brushed your shoulders. In another, silence reigned, broken only by the cracking of ice, the groan of glaciers inching forward across a barren land. The growth of ice reshaped more than landscapes. It pulled water from the seas, lowering coastlines, drying shallow basins. The swamps that had depended on those waters shrank further. Rivers changed their courses, redirected by the weight of ice far away. Winds shifted as the planet's heat was redistributed, carrying dry air into once humid forests. The green abundance faltered under a sky that no longer promised steady warmth. Speculatively, perhaps the creatures of the time felt this as disorientation. Amphibians, bound to their pools, found their world shrinking, their damp shelters drying. Reptiles, better suited for dry land, found new opportunities in the expanding plains. Insects, once abundant in every moist niche, now faced harsher cycles of plenty and scarcity. The forests, too, carried the memory of change. Their trunks, once thriving in endless swamps, stood brittle and vulnerable in the new air. To imagine this age is to picture a planet in tension. At the equator, green cathedrals of vegetation stretched upward, still vast, still full of life. But far south the land was locked in silence, a white continent gleaming beneath the sun. Between them stretched zones of transition, where forests and ice seemed to face each other across distance, two different earths sharing the same sky. At night, under a cold southern moon, the glaciers would have glittered with frozen light. Stars would shine fiercely, their reflections caught in endless ice. No croaks, no hum of insects, only the deep groan of the ice itself, moving slowly, reshaping the land with its weight. Meanwhile, far to the north, the night was alive with calls and rustles, a forest still clinging to its abundance. Speculatively, this collision of extremes may have been Earth's way of recalibrating itself. The swamps had exhaled too much oxygen, the forests had grown too vast, the balance tilted too far. Ice came as correction, cooling the air, drying the swamps, pruning back the overgrowth of life. It was not malice, but rhythm, the same planetary breath that had always shaped Earth, now exhaling cold instead of warmth. The glaciers advanced, retreated, advanced again. Each cycle carried consequences. Sea levels rising and falling, forests expanding and shrinking, animals adapting or vanishing. The Carboniferous paradise was not gone, but it was no longer eternal. It lived in balance with an age of ice, its green wonders shadowed by the gleam of frozen stone. To picture it is to hold two visions at once, a swamp alive with dragonflies, fireflies, and amphibian calls, and a frozen desert stretching to the horizon, silent but immense. Both were the Carboniferous, both were true. It was a world of contrasts, a planet divided, reminding us that even in its most abundant ages, Earth has always carried change in its heart. As the glaciers spread and the air cooled, life itself began to bend beneath the weight of change. The world that had once been endless swamps and oxygen-thick skies slowly narrowed. Where forests had towered in perpetual dampness, they now thinned, retreating like shadows before the cold. The creatures who had thrived in abundance found their kingdoms shrinking, their futures uncertain. Imagine walking through a forest on the cusp of collapse. The canopy, once dense enough to blot out the sun, now breaks apart, letting harsh light pierce the undergrowth. The air, once heavy and wet, is sharper, drier, carrying less of the earthy scent of peat and rot. The pools that once mirrored the sky shrink to muddy patches, their surfaces cracked. Insects still hum, but their chorus is thinner. Amphibians call, but their voices echo in smaller numbers. The silence between sounds feels longer, heavier, as though the forest itself is holding its breath. Plants were the first to falter. The towering lycopsids, those ancient trees with shallow roots, depended on constant water. As swamps dried, they toppled, their crowns collapsing into the mud, their remains adding to the thick layers of peat, but leaving the air above emptier. The endless green cathedrals that had defined the Carboniferous began to shrink, replaced by more resilient plants, seed ferns and their kin, able to survive in soils where water no longer lingered. The world was turning from swamp to plain, from wet abundance to drier resilience. With the fall of the forests came the decline of oxygen. The atmosphere that had once brimmed with 35% oxygen now began to settle back toward lower levels. The air grew thinner, less generous, less intoxicating. For the giant insects this was a slow death knell. Their bodies, built for an age of abundance, could no longer stretch so vast. Their wings beat heavier, their breathing less efficient. Slowly gigantism faded, replaced by smaller, more adaptable forms. The dragonflies still flew, but no longer as hawks of the air. The millipedes still crawled, but no longer as rolling walls of segments and legs. The Carboniferous giants were retreating with the swamps that had given them breath. Amphibians, too, suffered under the new climate. Their skins, thin and delicate, needed the moist embrace of swamps and streams. But as waters withdrew, their range narrowed. Pools became fewer, breeding grounds scarce, survival more precarious. Many vanished, entire lineages lost, their croaks silenced forever. Others clung to what wetlands remained, holding on while reptiles quietly stepped into the spaces left behind. Speculatively, perhaps this was the Earth's own way of pruning back its overgrowth. The Carboniferous had been a time of excess, oxygen overflowing, insects swelling to impossible sizes, forests sprawling endlessly. The cooling climate, the drying air, the retreat of swamps all worked together as a correction. Not destruction, but redirection. The planet itself seemed to be preparing the stage for a new chapter, trimming back the abundance of one age to make room for the rise of another. Imagine the atmosphere of this transition. Fires became less frequent as oxygen dropped, but the forests were already thinner, easier to cross, easier to see through. The soundscape changed, fewer deep croaks, fewer wing beats, more silence between noises. The texture of the ground changed, once spongy with water and peat, now firmer, dustier, more fractured. Even the light itself changed, no longer filtered through dense canopies, but falling unbroken, sharp and clear. The world was not ending, but it was shifting, and every creature felt the difference. Reptiles, small and quiet, thrived in this new world. Their eggs, sealed against a drying air, did not depend on pools or swamps. Their scaly skin protected them where amphibians faltered. As the forests shrank and plains spread, reptiles stepped forward into the sunlight, not in sudden conquest, but in steady persistence. They were not yet dominant, but they were patient, waiting for the world to tilt further in their favor. Speculatively, if you could have walked through this changing world, you might have felt the sense of something ending. The forests that had once felt eternal now seemed temporary, fragile. The giants of the air and undergrowth, once unstoppable, now seemed tired, fewer in number. The amphibian calls that once filled every night grew quieter, replaced by softer sounds, the rustle of reptiles in dry leaves, the whisper of wind across open ground. It was not a collapse all at once, but a fading slow and steady, like the dimming of twilight into night. And yet in that fading lay possibility. The world was not only losing, it was also preparing. The fall of the great swamps cleared the way for new ecosystems. The decline of giant insects opened niches for smaller forms. The retreat of amphibians left space for reptiles to rise. Life was restructuring, not ending. Earth was pruning its abundance, reshaping its song, turning the page to the next chapter of its long story. The Carboniferous was still alive, but its green empire was thinning. Its creatures were still present, but many now walked in the shadow of change. And above it all the planet continued its rhythm, cooling, shifting, preparing. What had been a world of swamps and giants was becoming a world of plains and resilience, a transition that would echo into the ages to come. The giants of the Carboniferous had ruled the skies and the undergrowth, with a presence that felt eternal. Dragonflies with wingspans wide enough to shadow the forest floor, millipedes as long as a small car, scorpions heavy and armored, all of them had thrived in the lush, oxygen-rich air. But as the atmosphere changed, their dominion began to unravel. The air, once swollen with 35% oxygen, began its slow descent toward the levels we know today. For creatures that breathed through delicate tubes and relied on diffusion, this was no minor change. It was a ceiling lowering, a cage tightening around their possibilities. The atmosphere that had once been their ally became a quiet limiter, reducing what their bodies could sustain. Imagine the skies first, once alive with the steady drone of dragonfly wings as broad as falcons, now quieter. The shadows above smaller. Meganeura, the aerial titan, still hunted in shafts of sunlight, its compound eyes glinting green and gold. But its reign was waning. Each generation found the air less generous. Its body, once supported easily, now strained against the weight of its own vastness. Slowly the line of giants narrowed, dwindled, gave way to smaller cousins whose wings needed less, demanded less, survived better in thinner air. On the forest floor the retreat was just as profound. Arthropleura, the colossal millipede, once rippling like a living wall of segments through moss and ferns, could no longer thrive. Its hundreds of legs, its armored back, its sheer bulk had been possible only in the thick breath of the earlier age. As oxygen fell, its presence became rarer, its shadow fading from the labyrinth of roots. In its place, smaller millipedes, more modest in scale, carried on the lineage, fitting themselves to a world that would no longer support giants. Scorpions, too, lost their enormity. Once the terrors of the undergrowth, with pincers as wide as a handspan and stingers curved like daggers, they found themselves constrained. The smaller forms endured, their bodies still dangerous but no longer monstrous. The great predators of shadow gave way to quieter hunters, scaled down by the chemistry of the air. Speculatively, to walk through a carboniferous forest during this transition would have been to feel a strange emptiness. The sounds were still there, wings buzzing, legs rustling, claws clicking, but softer, thinner. Where once a dragonfly's flight stirred the air into a breeze, now the smaller insects made only a faint vibration. Where once the ground quivered under the passage of a giant millipede, now it barely shifted. The scale of the forest's symphony was shrinking, and yet this was not simply loss, it was also renewal. The smaller forms that thrived were more adaptable, less bound to the excesses of a swollen atmosphere. They could live in harsher conditions, survive on less, spread into more varied environments. The decline of the giants was not the end of insects, but the reshaping of their kingdom. This moment was a pivot point, a reminder that the size of life itself is dictated not only by evolution, but by the invisible chemistry of the sky. The air, silent and unseen, sets boundaries no creature can cross. When oxygen was abundant, the boundaries stretched wide, and earth filled with monsters of scale. When oxygen fell, those boundaries closed in and life adjusted, becoming smaller, more efficient, more enduring. Speculatively, perhaps the forests themselves felt lighter as the giants faded. No longer did dragonflies wheel overhead like hawks. No longer did millipedes flatten moss in rippling waves. The forest floor, quieter now, belonged more to amphibians and reptiles, while the air buzzed with smaller wings, still bright but less imposing. The grandeur of the Carboniferous was softening, making way for subtler forms. At night, the change was especially felt. Where once the darkness echoed with the heavy winged beats of vast insects and the rustle of titanic bodies through undergrowth, now the sounds were finer, sharper, the high-pitched chirp of smaller crickets, the faint flutter of moths, the delicate rustle of tiny legs across bark. The forest was not silent, but it had changed register, from a booming chorus to a gentler song. The decline of the giants was the decline of spectacle, but also the beginning of resilience. Life was learning to live within new limits, to adapt to thinner air and harsher climates. The dragonfly no longer ruled the sky, but the insect lineage endured, preparing itself for ages to come. The millipede was no longer a moving wall, but its descendants would crawl through leaf litter for hundreds of millions of years more. Speculatively, perhaps this is the deepest lesson of the Carboniferous. That life is not only about flourishing in moments of abundance, but also about adjusting when abundance fades. That the giants of one age are the ancestors of the modest forms of another. That even as oxygen, forests, and swamps withdrew, life found ways to persist, to endure, to wait for new opportunities. The decline of the giant insects was the fading of a dreamlike chapter, a world where chemistry had inflated creatures into living marvels, but it was not the end of their story. It was a reshaping, a narrowing, a return to scales that could survive in the long rhythm of Earth's change. As the forests thinned and the air grew less generous, new creatures quietly took their place in the world's unfolding story. Small at first, unassuming, yet carrying within them a profound advantage. These were the reptiles, and unlike the amphibians, they were not bound to the swamps. Their eggs, sealed in protective shells, carried water within them, tiny worlds in miniature, safe from drying winds. Their skins, tougher and scaled, guarded them against the air that pulled moisture from every living thing. Where amphibians faltered in shrinking pools, reptiles walked steadily across drier ground, their survival written into every step. Imagine seeing one of these early reptiles for the first time. No larger than a lizard, perhaps, it slips between roots and fallen leaves, its scales catching faint light. Its eyes are sharp, alert, watching the undergrowth for insects or smaller prey. It does not need to return to water to lay its young. The forest floor itself can host the next generation. In this simple independence lies an evolutionary revolution, quiet but unstoppable. The reptiles were not spectacular giants, not yet. They did not soar like dragonflies or crawl like colossal millipedes. They were modest, almost forgettable among the wonders of their time. But their strength lay in persistence. They could endure when wetlands dried. They could cross landscapes where amphibians could not follow. They could spread into niches left vacant by the retreat of the swamps. And so, While the giants of the Carboniferous faded, reptiles expanded, step by step, egg by egg, into the spaces that opened before them. Speculatively, this was the true turning of the tide. The age of insects and amphibians was giving way to the age of reptiles, not suddenly, not with a roar or a clash, but with quiet resilience. Each scale, each shell, each cautious step forward carried the future within it. The dinosaurs, the mammals, even we ourselves would trace our lineage back to these small, tenacious creatures who first broke free from the tether of water. The forests still echoed with the croaks of amphibians, but their calls were growing fainter, more scattered. The buzz of insects still filled the air, but no longer with the force of giants. Meanwhile, the rustle of reptiles grew steadier, a scrape of claws on bark, the faint hiss of breath, the flicker of a tongue tasting the air. Their presence was subtle, but it was growing, woven deeper into the fabric of the changing earth. Imagine the texture of this new balance. The air, cooler now, carried less of the heavy musk of swamps and more of the dry scent of soil and stone. The ground felt firmer underfoot, the mud replaced by leaf litter and dust. The forests were more open, their shadows less suffocating, their light less filtered. In this environment, reptiles thrived, small, figures moving through spaces that had once been the realm of larger, less adaptable beings. Speculatively, perhaps they seemed fragile at first, easy to overlook. But their fragility was an illusion. The amniotic egg was armor disguised as simplicity, a fortress built from within. Their scales were shields, their lungs efficient in drier air, their bodies compact and steady. Where amphibians were tied to cycles of water and drought, reptiles were free, and freedom, in evolution, is often the strongest weapon of all. At night, their presence was even more subtle. While amphibians sang their twilight songs, the reptiles moved silently, unseen but constant, their small bodies pressed close to the earth for warmth, their eggs hidden under leaves, their young hatching into independence without pools or ponds. The stars shone above, unchanging, but below them the balance of life was shifting, quietly and irreversibly. The rise of reptiles was not dramatic in appearance, but profound in consequence. They were the survivors, the adapters, the inheritors of a world that was becoming drier, cooler, less forgiving. While amphibians clung to shrinking swamps, reptiles stepped boldly onto land that stretched farther and farther from water's edge. They did not just survive the changes of the Carboniferous, they turned those changes into opportunity. Speculatively, if the Carboniferous forests had been cathedrals of green, the reptiles were their pilgrims, small, determined, carrying the promise of something greater. Their footsteps were the first notes of a new chapter, one that would lead to the age of reptiles, the reign of dinosaurs, and beyond that, the rise of mammals. Each tiny creature, hidden in the undergrowth, was part of a revolution too vast to be seen in a single lifetime, but certain as the shifting of continents. And so, while the dragonflies grew smaller and the amphibians dwindled, the reptiles endured. Their eggs lay safe in dry soil. Their bodies carried them across plains and forests. Their persistence secured the future. This was the quiet claim of the Carboniferous reptiles. Not grandeur, not spectacle, but resilience. A resilience that would carry life through the end of one age and into the dawn of another. Yet between the fading reign of amphibians and the rise of reptiles lay a gallery of creatures so unusual, so unpolished, that they seem less like permanent residents of Earth, and more like sketches in a notebook, drafts of ideas, half-formed, fleeting. The Carboniferous was not only an age of giants and forests, it was also an age of experiments. Life, restless and inventive, tried shapes and strategies that would never be seen again. Imagine a slow river under heavy canopy, its waters dark and still. From beneath the surface rises the glimmer of eyes set in a flat white skull. This is no crocodile, though it might be as large as one. It is an amphibian predator, with a body long and powerful, limbs splayed out like paddles, and jaws lined with teeth meant for gripping slippery prey. In the gloom, it glides forward, silent, waiting for a fish or smaller creature to draw near. When it strikes, the water erupts, then closes again, leaving only ripples in the dim light. These were the labyrinthodons, amphibians that seemed caught between worlds, their bodies not yet perfected, their forms strange to modern eyes. Elsewhere, in shallower waters, you might find amphibians that looked more like eels than frogs. Long serpentine bodies undulated through the currents, their tiny limbs little more than ornaments. Some had no legs at all, just elongated spines and smooth skin. They swam like ribbons, weaving through roots and reeds, their movements hypnotic, ghost-like. These forms, though eerie and otherworldly, left no legacy. They were experiments that did not continue, yet for their moment they were part of the Carboniferous tapestry, alive and vital in the waterways that fed the forests. On drier ground, stranger shapes emerged still. Picture a small creature basking on a fallen log, its back lined with a tall, thin sail of skin stretched across elongated spines. This was one of the earliest fin-backed proto-reptiles, not yet the great sail-backed Dimetrodon of later ages, but a forerunner already carrying the blueprint of forms to come. The sail may have caught sunlight, warming its blood, or perhaps helped it display to rivals and mates. Whatever its purpose, it rose like a banner above the forest floor, a silhouette that must have looked alien against the dense green canopy. Speculatively, these transitional creatures gave the Carboniferous a dreamlike experimental quality. To wander through its forests and rivers was to enter a world where nature's imagination ran untamed. Some forms were elegant, the dragonfly, the towering tree, the sleek amphibian. Others were ungainly, awkward, almost implausible, but all of them were alive, each one testing the possibilities of flesh and bone under the strange rules of the time. Consider the scale of it. In rivers, predators, as long as canoes, waiting in silence. On the forest floor, proto-reptiles with sails catching light. In the undergrowth, lizard-like animals with wide flattened bodies and tiny grasping limbs. Many of these forms would vanish entirely, leaving no descendants, no echoes in later ages. They were branches on evolution's tree that ended abruptly, cut short by climate, competition, or simply the turning of the planet's rhythm. Yet their presence gave the Carboniferous its uncanny atmosphere. Imagine walking along a swampy trail, the ground soft and damp beneath your feet. Suddenly a movement ahead. A long eel-bodied amphibian sliding back into the water, its skin glistening. Or perhaps a glimpse of a creature with a tall sail, slipping between trunks before vanishing into shadow. These encounters would have felt uncanny, both familiar and alien, as though the world itself had not yet decided which forms to keep and which to abandon. At night the strangeness deepened. The calls of amphibians echoed across the rivers, low and resonant, like drums in the darkness. Shapes moved in the water, their outlines blurred by moonlight, their forms unsettling. On land, the faint rustle of leaves betrayed the presence of reptiles, their sails catching the starlight for an instant before vanishing again. The Carboniferous night was alive not only with abundance, but with experiments, fleeting lives testing possibilities in the long, slow arc of evolution. Speculatively, perhaps this is what made the age feel so dreamlike. It was not only its forests and giants, but the sense that life itself was fluid, not fixed, shifting between forms with abandon. An amphibian could be eel-like, crocodile-like, or ribbon-thin. A reptile could carry a sail or none at all. The rules were still being written, and in that openness, evolution explored paths that would never be taken again. Many of these creatures left only fragments in stone, a jawbone here, a spine there, impressions in mud. Yet even in their incompleteness, the fossils speak of an age when Earth was a laboratory, experimenting on scales both grand and strange, and though most of these experiments ended, they were not failures. They were part of the process, steps on the way to the creatures that would come later. The Carboniferous, in this sense, was not only an age of abundance, but also of uncertainty. The forests and swamps were filled with creatures that seemed provisional, as if the planet itself were sketching ideas, erasing some, keeping others. To walk through it was to witness nature's drafts, vivid but temporary, each one a possibility that flickered for a time before fading into silence. If the Carboniferous world teaches us anything, it is that evolution is not a straight road, but a winding river, branching, splitting, disappearing, and reforming. For every lineage that carried forward into the future, dozens more flickered briefly and were gone. It was not a process of perfect efficiency, but of trial and error, of experiments both grand and fleeting. Imagine wandering the edges of a Carboniferous swamp, the air thick with mist, the ground soft underfoot. Around you move creatures whose forms feel half-finished. An amphibian with limbs too small for its long eel-like body slides into the water. A proto-reptile lifts its head, its sail catching the morning light, though its species will leave no heirs. Each one is alive, vital, part of its world, and yet most will vanish, their lines ending quietly in the march of time. To witness them is to glimpse the drafts of life's great story, most of which never made it to later chapters. This is the truth of Earth's history. Most life is temporary, even in ages of abundance. When the forests soared and the air shimmered with wings, most creatures were not destined to endure. They were possibilities tested against the shifting climate, the thinning oxygen, the rising mountains, the retreating seas. Some could not adjust, others were simply outcompeted. Their bones sank into mud, their outlines pressed into stone, their names lost. Speculatively, perhaps this is the most humbling lesson of the Carboniferous, that survival is not about grandeur or spectacle, but about resilience, timing, and chance. The dragonflies were magnificent, yet they shrank with the air. The millipedes were titanic, yet they vanished as the forests faltered. The amphibians ruled waterways, yet their dependence on water bound them to decline. In their place, smaller insects, sturdier reptiles, and modest plants endured, not because they were greater, but because they were better suited to the new rhythm of the earth. To walk in this world would have been to feel both awe and impermanence, awe at the sheer diversity of forms, so many shapes of life unfolding at once, impermanence in the knowledge that most of what you saw would not last, that the forest was filled with futures that would never come. Every call of an amphibian, every rustle in the undergrowth, every ripple in a river carried the weight of uncertainty. At night, this truth would have lingered in the stillness. You might hear the croak of a labyrinthodont echo across the swamp, deep, resonant, commanding. But in geological time, that voice would soon be silenced. You might see the shadow of a fin-backed reptile crossing the forest floor. Strange, alien, captivating. Yet its lineage would end, leaving only fragments of bone and stone. The night was alive with possibility, but also with impermanence, as though the forest itself knew that it was full of drafts, sketches, and fleeting ideas. Speculatively, perhaps this is why the Carboniferous feels dreamlike to us. It was not only a world of abundance, but of transition, of lives that were not meant to last. Like a dream, it was vivid, filled with strange images, dragonflies the size of hawks, millipedes like moving walls, amphibians as long as crocodiles. But it was also fleeting, dissolving into the next age, leaving only fragments behind. And yet, these experiments were not wasted. Each vanished lineage shaped the world in subtle ways. Their bodies fed ecosystems, their failures cleared paths for others. Their brief existences tested possibilities that later creatures might refine. Evolution is not efficient, but it is persistent. It tries, fails, and tries again, sculpting life not through perfection, but through endless iteration. Speculatively, if we could see the Carboniferous as the earth saw it, perhaps we would not judge its vanished creatures as failures. They were part of the rhythm, part of the great cycle of attempt and renewal. Their brevity was not their weakness but their role, to fill a moment, to explore a possibility, to be part of the unfolding story even if their chapter was short. The lesson is clear. Life is fragile, temporary, experimental. The giants of the Carboniferous remind us that even the most astonishing forms can vanish. The forests remind us that abundance can collapse, and the transitional creatures, half-formed, fleeting, remind us that most of what exists will not last. But in this impermanence lies beauty, the beauty of a world forever in motion, forever reshaping itself, forever trying new forms in the endless experiment of existence. The Carboniferous whispers to us across time. Abundance is temporary, permanence is an illusion, and every creature, no matter how strange or short-lived, is part of Earth's grand design. As the Carboniferous age moved toward its close, the green empire that had stretched unbroken across the equator began to falter. The swamps that had once seemed eternal, vast as continents, and rich beyond imagination, were shrinking. Where towering lycopsids had grown in endless ranks, open plains began to spread. Where the ground had once been soft with peat and water, it now cracked under drier skies. And with the retreat of the swamps came something striking in the geological record, the sudden absence of coal. This absence is called the coal gap, and it is one of the most haunting signatures left in stone. For tens of millions of years, the swamps of the Carboniferous had been factories of coal, laying down vast seams of compressed plant matter. Every tree that fell into stagnant waters, every fern that sank into mud, every moss that collapsed beneath its own growth, all were preserved, layer upon layer, into the black seams that fuel us today. Then suddenly the process slowed. Coal formation nearly ceased. The forests that had once been the breath and legacy of the age collapsed in waves of ecological upheaval. Imagine standing at the edge of a swamp in this moment of change. The water is shallower, its edges receding. The towering trees stand thinner, their roots exposed, their leaves sparser. The air, once heavy with moisture, feels lighter, drier, carrying the faint scent of decay. Insects still buzz, amphibians still croak, but their voices are scattered, less certain, as though the chorus of life has lost its harmony. The peat beneath your feet no longer accumulates as it once did. What falls into the water now decomposes more completely, leaving less behind for the ages to press into stone. The swamp is still alive, but its legacy is already fading. The coal gap was not a single moment, but a drawn-out transition, a slow unraveling of the systems that had sustained abundance. As glaciers spread across Gondwana, as seas retreated and climates shifted, the delicate balance of warmth and wetness that had fueled the forests broke down. Without constant flooding, the swamps could not thrive. Without swamps, there was less peat. Without peat, no coal. The earth itself had closed a chapter, moving on from its long experiment in green abundance. Speculatively, perhaps the forests fell not with a roar, but with a whisper. Tree by tree, swamp by swamp, the green cathedrals became patchworks, then fragments, then memories. The air grew thinner of oxygen. The fires burned less often. The giants shrank, and through it all, the silence of the coal gap spread, a silence not of life ending entirely, but of one kind of world yielding to another. This collapse rippled across ecosystems. Amphibians that had ruled the waterways found themselves stranded in shrinking pools, their numbers dwindling. Giant insects that had once ruled the skies struggled in thinner air, their lineages breaking into smaller forms. Even the plants themselves changed. The great lycopsids, with their shallow roots and towering trunks, gave way to seed ferns and other hardier species that could endure drier conditions. Life was not gone, but it was transformed, rewritten in a new key. To imagine the coal gap is to imagine absence, absence of the vast humid swamps, absence of the ceaseless accumulation of peat, absence of the green labyrinth that had defined the Carboniferous. It is as though the earth itself drew a breath, paused, and exhaled a different rhythm. The forests were still there, but they were no longer the world-shaping forces they had been. The coal stopped forming, the seams ended. The record in the stone tells us what the creatures of that age must have felt. The abundance was gone. At night, the change would have been palpable. Where once the swampy air echoed with the chorus of countless frogs, insects, and strange amphibians, the soundscape grew thinner. The stars above remained eternal, but below them the chorus of the green world had softened. Pools reflected the moonlight, but they were smaller, fewer, isolated. The forests no longer closed so thickly overhead. The sky was more open, the air clearer, the world quieter. Speculatively, the coal gap reminds us that ecosystems, no matter how vast, are fragile. The Carboniferous swamps had dominated the planet, reshaping the air, fueling the giants, writing coal into the earth itself. And yet, with shifts in climate and geography, they could collapse, not instantly, but steadily, inevitably. Their greatness was real but not permanent. Their abundance was breathtaking, but also temporary. The coal gap was not only a geological pause, it was a symbol. It marked the end of an age when plants ruled the earth with unchecked power, when swamps dictated the breath of the planet. In its place came a more balanced, more varied world, one where reptiles began to rise, where insects adjusted to smaller sizes, where forests became less sprawling but more resilient. The Carboniferous had burned brightly, but its light dimmed as Earth moved toward its next chapter. And so, the coal gap is both silence and transition. A silence in the seams of rock, where black coal ceases and lighter stone takes its place. A transition in life itself, from abundance to resilience, from swamps to plains, from giants to smaller forms. It is a reminder that even the most powerful systems can falter, and that every age carries within it the seeds of its own ending. The earth that emerged after the coal gap was not the same green cathedral that had defined the Carboniferous. It was leaner, drier, more uncertain. The endless swamps that had once stretched across the equator were fractured into pockets, their humid air replaced in many places by winds that carried the scent of dust. the towering lycopsids, those strange trees with their scaled trunks, were no longer the architects of the world. Instead, hardier plants, seed ferns and early conifers stepped into the spaces left behind, their roots anchoring in soils that no longer held constant water. Imagine walking across such a transformed landscape. The ground beneath your feet is firmer, no longer the sponge of peat and swamp, but drier, crackling with leaves. The air is different too, cooler, thinner, its oxygen no longer swelling every breath with the same richness. The chorus of life is quieter, no longer dominated by the booming presence of amphibians or the whirring wings of giant dragonflies, but by subtler sounds, the rustle of reptiles and leaf litter, the faint buzz of smaller insects, the whisper of wind through drier trees. For tens of millions of years, the world had been defined by excess of oxygen, of swamps, of green life pressing into every corner. But in this new age, excess gave way to scarcity. Many creatures could not follow. The amphibians that had ruled rivers and marshes dwindled. The insects that had stretched biology to its limits shrank back within new boundaries. The forests themselves faltered, their vastness breaking into smaller, scattered strongholds. And yet even in this moment of contraction, life endured. The reptiles, small and unassuming, expanded into the new spaces, carrying with them the quiet innovation of the amniotic egg. Plants that could tolerate drier conditions flourished, reshaping the landscape into one less swampy, more varied. It was not the end of life, but the end of a kind of life, the closing of one chapter so that another could begin. Speculatively, perhaps the Carboniferous offers us a lesson written in deep time, that even when abundance seems eternal, it can vanish in geological moments, that the systems that appear strongest may carry fragility hidden within them, and that collapse, though painful, is also transition, the reshaping of the Earth story into something new. The once green Earth had entered a more uncertain age, but uncertainty is not emptiness, it is possibility. The swamps were gone, the coal no longer forming, but reptiles walked forward into the dry light, plants rooted themselves in new soils, and the story of life continued, different but unbroken. The Carboniferous may feel impossibly distant, its forests long buried, its creatures pressed into stone, and yet in a quiet, haunting way, it lives with us still. Every time a light flickers on, every time a machine hums to life, every time smoke drifts from a chimney, we are touching that ancient world. For the coal that powers us, the oil that fuels us, the carbon that shapes our climate, all are gifts, or perhaps ghosts, of the Carboniferous. Imagine holding a lump of coal in your hand. Its surface is black matte, almost ordinary, yet within it lies the memory of a swamp older than mountains, a forest where dragonflies wheeled and amphibians croaked in the mist. That piece of coal was once sunlight caught by lycopsids and ferns, trapped in their tissues, buried when they fell into swamps, pressed by time into stone. To burn it now is to release that sunlight again, to resurrect a breath taken hundreds of millions of years ago. Speculatively, when you see smoke rising from a chimney, you might imagine it as the forest returning, not in green leaves and shadows, but in whispers of carbon carried into the sky. Every flicker of flame is the echo of a swamp fire long past. Every engine a reminder that the Carboniferous still powers our present. We are, in a sense, living in partnership with a world long gone, drawing energy from its remains even as we reshape the atmosphere it once created. And in this, there's both wonder and warning. Wonder that life so ancient still fuels life today, that the abundance of the Carboniferous continues to ripple across time. Warning that the carbon once locked safely underground now floods back into the air, changing our climate, echoing the same delicate balances that once ended the green empire of the swamps. Just as the forests of the Carboniferous reshaped their world, so too do we, breathing carbon into the sky in quantities the planet must now absorb, adjust to, or resist. To reflect on this is to feel the Carboniferous, not as a vanished age, but as a presence woven into the fabric of our days. The coal in our fires, the fuel in our engines, the carbon in our atmosphere, all are reminders that the past is never gone. It lingers, it resurfaces, it shapes the present in ways both subtle and immense. The forests of the Carboniferous may be buried, but they are not silent. Their echoes hum in the lights we switch on, in the warmth of a fire, in the haze of the air we breathe. They remind us that the distance between past and present is thinner than we imagine, that even now we are still entangled with a forgotten world. The Carboniferous reminds us that the balance of life and atmosphere is delicate and never guaranteed. Once oxygen swelled the skies, turning insects into giants and feeding forests that seemed eternal. But when the climate cooled, when seas withdrew and glaciers spread, that same atmosphere shifted. The giants shrank, the swamps collapsed, and coal stopped forming. What felt permanent was revealed as fragile, undone not by catastrophe alone, but by the slow turn of planetary rhythms. Speculatively, we may be standing at such a threshold ourselves. Today, as we burn the very coal left by those ancient swamps, we release its carbon into the air. The atmosphere thickens, not with oxygen this time, but with greenhouse gases. The balance shifts again, reshaping climates, melting ice, raising seas. Just as the forests of the Carboniferous remade the earth, so too do we, but at a pace far swifter than nature's slow unfolding. Imagine this parallel as two mirrors facing each other. In one, the Carboniferous, forests so vast they drowned the world in oxygen, fires sweeping across the land, swamps sinking into stone. In the other, our own age, forests cleared, fossil fuels burning, carbon spilling back into the air. Both moments reveal the same truth, that Earth's systems are not fixed, but responsive, alive, vulnerable to change. The lesson is humbling. The creatures of the Carboniferous did not intend to alter their world, and yet their forests shifted the very air. We, by contrast, know what we are doing, and still we press forward, reshaping the atmosphere on a global scale. Speculatively, perhaps we are writing the next coal gap, a mark in stone that future ages will read as the moment when abundance faltered, when climates tipped, when life adjusted to yet another upheaval. Imagine standing at the edge of a modern city at dusk, the air hazed with smoke, the lights glowing with energy drawn from ancient coal. Beneath your feet lies stone layered with the remains of swamps long gone, their carbon waiting until we unearthed it. Above the sky holds more of that carbon each year, invisible but powerful, bending weather, raising seas, changing the rhythm of the earth. The connection is direct, undeniable. We breathe in the echoes of the Carboniferous, and in return we write our own story into the air. The fragility of Earth's systems is not a weakness but a rhythm, a reminder that nothing is fixed, that every age carries its own rise and decline. The Carboniferous teaches us that balance can be lost and found again, but always at a cost, and in its story we hear an echo of our own. The Carboniferous, when we pause to look back on it, feels like both a dream and a lesson. It was an age when forests rose into towering cathedrals of green, when dragonflies filled the skies with wings that shimmered in sunlight, when amphibians and reptiles walked through steaming swamps, beneath a sky swollen with oxygen. It was a world that seemed endless in its abundance, a paradise sculpted in moss and mist. And yet that same world was fragile, its balance easily tipped, its greatness destined to fade. To walk imaginatively through the Carboniferous is to see how deeply Earth shapes life, and how life, in turn, shapes Earth. The forests did not simply grow, they transformed the air itself, filling it with oxygen, reshaping fire, fueling giants. The glaciers did not simply spread, they redirected rivers, silenced swamps, and rewrote climates. Every tree, every storm, every shift of land and sea was part of a vast interwoven system, delicate and immense. Speculatively, perhaps the greatest teaching of the Carboniferous is humility. It reminds us that life is not a story of steady progress, but of branching paths, experiments, and endings. For every creature that endured, the reptiles, the seed ferns, the smaller insects, there were dozens that vanished, their forms too specialized, too fragile to survive change. Even the swamps themselves, which seemed eternal, proved temporary, collapsing when the air and water no longer favored them. Picture the lesson written in sensory detail: the hiss of fire racing through oxygen-rich trees, the groan of ice carving across Gondwana, the buzz of insects filling a swampy night, and then the silence when forests thinned, when giants disappeared, when coal stopped forming. Each sound is a reminder that abundance is fragile, that life thrives not in permanence but in cycles. The Carboniferous teaches us that Earth is not passive ground beneath our feet, but a living partner in the story of life, shifting, breathing, reshaping. Its chemistry sets the limits of size, its climates define where forests grow, its seas and glaciers redraw the map of what is possible, and in return, life writes itself into stone and air, leaving behind legacies that ripple forward through millions of years. It is, ultimately, a story of both wonder and warning. Wonder that Earth can create such strangeness, dragonflies as wide as eagles, millipedes as long as cars, amphibians as large as crocodiles. Warning that even the most astonishing worlds can vanish, undone by the slow rhythms of change. The Carboniferous whispers that our own world, too, is fragile, and that to live upon it is to live within a balance that must always be tended, never assumed. The Carboniferous ended, as all ages do, not with silence but with transformation. The forests fell back, the swamps retreated, the giants shrank, and the air itself changed. Yet even in this fading, life endured. The reptiles, modest and resilient, carried their fragile eggs onto dry land. The smaller insects found their place within thinner air. Plants with sturdier roots and hardier seeds took hold in soils no longer drenched in water. The world did not die. It reshaped itself, as it always has. Speculatively, perhaps this is the deepest truth the Carboniferous offers us, that no age, no matter how lush or strange, lasts forever. And yet, Earth itself abides. Its surface shifts, its skies change, its forests rise and fall, but always life finds a way to continue. The amphibians may have faded, the coal swamps may have ended, but their passing opened the path to reptiles, to dinosaurs, to mammals, and eventually to us. Imagine watching the cycle unfold as if in a long dream. Green cathedrals collapsing into silence, plains spreading where swamps once stretched, glaciers carving across stone, then melting away. Each scene gives way to another, not as loss but as renewal. The Carboniferous was not erased. It was written into coal seams, into fossils, into the very chemistry of the air, its memory preserved even as the world moved forward. At dusk in that ancient world, You might have heard the last booming calls of giant amphibians echoing across shrinking pools. At dawn, you might have seen reptiles stirring quietly in the underbrush, their small forms carrying the future. Each sound, each movement, was part of the cycle, endings woven seamlessly into beginnings. And so the Carboniferous stands as a reminder. Earth is not fixed but rhythmic. Its history is a succession of worlds, each strange, each temporary, each giving way to what comes next. The green labyrinth of the Carboniferous yielded to the age of reptiles, just as that age yielded to the dinosaurs, and theirs to mammals, and ours will one day give way as well. It is not tragedy, but the rhythm of renewal, the great breath of a planet that is never still. In this way, the Carboniferous is not only a memory of what once was, but a reassurance that even as worlds vanish, Earth endures, that even as forests fall, new forms of life will rise, that even as abundance collapses, renewal waits in silence, ready to begin again. So now, as you rest in the quiet of this story, imagine stepping softly into a Carboniferous forest. The air is thick, rich with oxygen, heavy as though every breath carries the weight of life itself. Around you, trunks rise like pillars, their bark patterned in scales, their crowns disappearing into mist. Light filters down in fragments, glimmering across pools that reflect the green above. Above your head, wings beat, the low hum of dragonflies, vast and shimmering, drifting through shafts of sun. At your feet, the undergrowth stirs with amphibians, their bodies slick with water, their wide eyes gleaming as they slip back into shadow. The forest is alive with rustles, croaks, and whispers, a chorus both alien and familiar. You are surrounded not by myth, but by memory, the living memory of Earth itself. And though the swamps are gone, though the forests have long since fallen, their essence lingers, in the seams of coal deep underground, in the fossils pressed flat like pages of a forgotten book, in the air we breathe today, written by their ancient work. To burn coal now is to summon that age again, to release its sunlit breath into our sky. Every spark, every flicker, every ember is a voice from the Carboniferous, rising from beneath the ground to remind us of what was. Speculatively, perhaps you can picture it. Flames glowing in the dark, each one a fragment of an ancient swamp, each ember a memory of Earth's green empire. The forests may have fallen silent, but their light still burns, carried across time into our present. Their story is not lost. It is written in fire, in stone, in the very rhythm of the planet that continues to breathe and renew. And with that thought, let the images fade gently. The mist, the dragonflies, the glimmering pools, the quiet flames of coal. The Carboniferous remains with us, not gone, not forgotten, but alive in memory, in energy, in echoes that whisper still, whenever we pause to listen,